Chapter 526. At daybreak, White Lotus finally broke through the encirclement. She was covered in blood as she fought her way out of the encirclement. She had shaken off the pursuers. She was exhausted and her whole body was in pain, but she couldn't care less at this moment. After confirming that she was temporarily safe, her first reaction was to start looking for Lu Chen's whereabouts. However, Lu Chen and the huge black dog had already disappeared without a trace. This was really a very miserable and unlucky feeling. White Lotus was so angry that she almost crushed her silver teeth. But obviously, even if she died of anger, no one would come to collect her corpse. So in the end, she could only swallow her anger and find a secluded forest to hide. Then, she began to treat her wounds and planned to rest for a while to recover her strength before continuing to look for traces of Lu Chen. Fortunately, she knew where Lu Chen's destination was. As long as she followed along the road to Mount Kunlun, she would probably be able to find him. This was also the only hope in this bad luck, but she didn't know when she could find him. Perhaps, when the time came, she could provoke him and make him fall out with Supreme Tianlan. Destroying his future, making Supreme Tianlan suspicious of him, and it would be best if he killed him with his own hands. That would be the best. Thinking of this hatefully, White Lotus actually felt a little happy. She took off her coat and began to bandage her wounds. But at this moment, it could be seen that the battle she had experienced last night was really fierce. There were wounds on her front and back. Although they were not fatal or too serious, at a glance, the scarred appearance of this teenage girl formed an extremely harsh contrast with her elegant and refined appearance. It also made people want to sigh. Perhaps a beautiful fairy should stand high above the clouds, not eating the food of the mortal world, looking down on all living beings, and being admired and revered by people. And this girl in front of them was probably the unlucky one who fell into the mortal world and fell into the dust. So, someone really sighed. White Lotus's body tensed up and she suddenly jumped up. Her expression was tense, like a fierce and angry little beast. Her eyes were cold and sharp. Looking at the shadow behind the forest, she shouted in a low voice, "Who is it?" The grass and trees shook violently. Then, a black dog ran out from the shadows of the plants. It stood there and didn't come over. It just looked at White Lotus and barked. White Lotus was stunned for a moment, and a trace of astonishment flashed across her face. But somehow, her body slowly relaxed. A moment later, the shadow behind Black Dog shook and Lu Chen walked out. He stood there and looked at White Lotus. His gaze swept across the wounds on her fair skin. He shook his head helplessly and said, "Do you need my help, Scram?" White Lotus sat on the ground, gnashing her teeth, her body trembling slightly. "I don't need you. Ouch, it hurts, to help me." "It's right that it hurts." Lu Chen sat behind her. Like magic, there were a lot of medicine, white cloth and other things around him. Then, he treated the wound on White Lotus's back. At the same time, he said, "At least they didn't put poison on their weapons. Otherwise, you would be in more trouble." White Lotus clenched her fists. Her face was so pale that there was almost no blood. It was obvious that she was trying her best to bear it. After a few breaths, she said angrily, "In any case, they are people of Xianxia. How can people of the righteous side poison?" "You are wrong." Lu Chen put down the blood-stained cloth in his hand. Then, he took the medicine and gently sprinkled some white powder on White Lotus's wound. White Lotus's body trembled. She sucked in a breath of cold air. Her voice was hurried and she groaned a few times. But, in the end, she managed to hold it back. Lu Chen put down the medicine bottle and said, "When it comes to sinister methods like poisoning, there is really no one in the world who can compare to us Xianxia. Oh, especially in Fuyunji. That is a place where talents and experts gather. So, you were lucky to be able to escape last night." White Lotus was silent. She did not know why, but her eyes seemed to soften a little. Behind her, Lu Chen saw that the medicine powder had been integrated into the wound. Then, he began to treat the other wounds. After a while, he finally finished treating the wounds on White Lotus's back. Although Lu Chen had always been a man with a heart of stone and was used to seeing blood and death, he could not help but frown when he looked at the girl in front of him. After a moment of hesitation, he said to White Lotus, "These wounds are many and deep. In the future, your back may have a lot of scars." White Lotus did not seem to care. She only sneered and did not turn around. She said calmly, "I also have a wound here on my chest. It can't be erased. Do you want to take a look?" Lu Chen was suddenly speechless. He looked a little embarrassed. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. He used a white cloth to gently wrap up the wounds on White Lotus's body. After everything was done, he stood up and turned his back to White Lotus. Soon, there was the sound of clothes being put on. Lu Chen suddenly saw a black dog, who was lying not far away, suddenly raise its head and look behind him. Lu Chen glared at the dog. Atsu was shocked. It shrank its head and then lowered its head. Lu Chen was silent for a moment. He said slowly, "You should know in your heart that I will not tell you that I regret stabbing you." The sound behind him stopped for a moment. It was as if White Lotus's movement had stopped for a moment. After a while, White Lotus walked over after putting on her clothes. She looked at Lu Chen and said coldly, "Remember, I will return this stab to you sooner or later." Lu Chen nodded and said, "Okay, I will remember. There are probably no good people in Fuyunji, right?" As she walked out of the forest, White Lotus looked in the direction where she came from. She looked at the vague outline of the giant city and said with disgust. Lu Chen walked past her and said, "The people who surrounded you last night were probably not from Fuyunji. Otherwise, you would have some troublesome things to deal with now. But, you are right." He nodded in agreement and said, "I also feel that there are not many good people in Fuyunji." White Lotus looked at him and said, "So after fighting with the demonic order for so many years, you are fighting poison with poison. What about you? You are also a kind of poison, right?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment and said, "I am probably a kind of poison." White Lotus stared at him for a moment. She suddenly could not help but laugh. She shook her head and walked forward. She said, "I don't know why my Shishu was blind. He actually fell for you and even accepted you as his disciple. I really don't understand." Lu Chen followed, smiled, and said, "Oh, so you don't think I can do it?" White Lotus snorted and said, "You're far worse than me. In terms of birth and talent, aren't I better than you in both?" Lu Chen thought for a moment. He shook his head and did not speak. He only looked into the distance and smiled gently. He then asked, "Oh right, looking at you, could it be that you chased after me last night? What is your intention?" Chapter 527. I'm tired of staying here. "I want to go home," White Lotus said. "Go home." Lu Chen was momentarily dazed. After a moment of silence, he said, "I actually forgot that you have a family." White Lotus rolled her eyes, but she soon said somewhat helplessly, "It doesn't matter. I often forget it myself." The two of them looked at each other and laughed. Although they were far from trusting each other, the atmosphere between the two of them eased up a little. Lu Chen didn't seem to have any intention of asking White Lotus's intentions, so he continued walking forward. White Lotus's surname was Bai, and she was born in the Bai clan in Kunwa City, which was at the foot of the Kunlun Mountains. Speaking of which, when Hakushin Jinkuan was still around, White Lotus became his last disciple. However, it was widely rumored that Hakushin Jinkuan was a member of the Bai clan and that he was the Bai clan's biggest backer, which made the Bai clan quite famous for a period of time. However, just like the so-called Tianlan and Tianying, Bai Chen was in fact a Daoist name and not a real name. It was given by Tianlan and Bai Chen's master, Patriarch Tianhong, and not his real name. Therefore, Hakushin Jinkuan had nothing to do with the Bai clan. However, Hakushin Jinkuan's status was too high, so he couldn't be bothered with such rumors. The Bai clan, on the other hand, had an ambiguous attitude. Of course, they didn't dare to spread rumors in public. However, they let it slide from the beginning to the end. They acted like they were wise men and never denied it. They still held the attitude that they would be bastards if they didn't take advantage of the situation. This was no secret in the eyes of those with a bit of status in the Kunlun party. Therefore, Lu Chen never interacted with the Bai clan and didn't have a good impression of them. Back then, when he was suspicious of White Lotus, he asked Old Ma to secretly investigate them, but in the end, he didn't find anything. White Lotus wanted to go home. The Bai clan was in Kunwa City, so they naturally had to go to the Westland's Kunlun Mountains. When White Lotus turned to ask Lu Chen where he was going, Lu Chen could only helplessly say, "I'm going to the Kunlun Mountains." Since their destination was the same and they knew each other, traveling together seemed to be a matter of course. However, this was only for ordinary people. Lu Chen was not an ordinary person. On the contrary, he had always been different from the others. So, what should have been a scene of the two of them loving each other and walking together didn't happen. Lu Chen said very straightforwardly to White Lotus, "The mountain is high and the road is long. Let's part ways here. Goodbye." With that, he turned around and walked away. White Lotus was stunned for a moment, as if she was stunned by this man. After a while, she came back to her senses. She angrily stamped her feet and chased after Lu Chen to stop him. She angrily said, "What do you mean? What did I do to provoke you? Why are you running away as soon as you see me?" Lu Chen sternly said, "I'm afraid that if I fall asleep in the middle of the night, I'll lose my life at some point." As he spoke, he actually turned to look at the black dog beside him and asked, "What do you think, Atsu?" The large black dog blinked, and then nodded vigorously. He looked as if he wanted to raise his tail to show his approval. "You ate those demonic beast meat for nothing." White Lotus scolded angrily and said, "This stupid dog is very stupid. How can you trust it and ask it?" Atsu was furious. It bared its teeth and let out a threatening growl. It looked a little scary. White Lotus didn't even look at it. She just snorted and said, "What are you barking for? If you shout again, I'll let you bleed later." Atsu's neck suddenly shrank as if it was shivering. In fact, Atsu had been reborn after experiencing the southern wilderness and the Great Snow Mountain. It was no longer the same as the weak little mud in the past. However, in the past on Kunlun Mountain, the blood-eating secret method that White Lotus set up was too bloody and terrifying. It probably left a very deep and indelible impression on it. Lu Chen didn't intend to help the black dog that was immersed in its unfortunate memories. Anyway, Atsu would not die even if it was scolded a few times. He just frowned and said, "We'll go our own ways and be at peace with each other. Why do you have to make it so obvious?" White Lotus looked at him and suddenly sneered, "If it's Su Qingjun, I'm afraid it'll be the other way around. You'll be the one pestering her to go with you, and Shiji Su won't be willing to go with you, right?" Lu Chen thought for a while and actually nodded, more or less. After hearing what he said, White Lotus lost her temper for a moment. She rolled her eyes and asked Lu Chen, "Why do I feel like you've been guarding against me and suspecting me?" Lu Chen pointed at himself and said, "Do you think I look stupid?" White Lotus said, "No." Lu Chen said, "All right, then I don't believe you can run out of Immortal City by yourself." White Lotus said, "I'm also very powerful." Lu Chen snorted and said, "No matter how powerful you are, can you be more powerful than the damn Baldy? You're in his hands. As long as he doesn't let go, I don't believe you can run away." White Lotus was discouraged for a moment, then she sneered, "Look at you calling the damn Baldy. It seems like you're very disrespectful to Lord Perfected Immortal." Lu Chen said, "I'll give him a big head. You can go back and say that to him directly." White Lotus was dumbfounded and looked at Lu Chen as if she was looking at a monster. After a while, she said, "What should I say to him? I was almost suffocated by him. Now that I finally have the chance to come out, I have to take a breather before going back." Lu Chen looked at her from the corner of his eyes and said, "Since you're out, you don't plan to run?" White Lotus was silent for a while and said, "I won't run. I'm afraid I won't be able to escape and will die even faster." Lu Chen frowned and sighed, but he didn't say anything. In the end, the two of them didn't separate and still walked on the road to Kunlun Mountain together. Although White Lotus didn't say why she came, Lu Chen pretended not to know. This was probably because people were tired of living. Atsu was a little dissatisfied with this and expressed it very clearly. However, the two humans ignored it. This made Atsu very depressed. They could only stroll around all day and refused to go near White Lotus. And White Lotus was also very loyal to her mission and began to ask some questions to Lu Chen from time to time. How old are you this year? Why are you asking this? What kind of magical power do you practice? Do you think I will tell you this kind of thing? How many people have you killed? I can't remember. How many women have you slept with? Is this something a girl like you should ask? How many? Not one. You're lying, right? Who are you lying to? Well, one last question. If you answer me properly, I won't bother you anymore. I'm already very annoyed. Don't ask anymore. Have you ever really fallen in love with a woman? Lu Chen, who was walking, suddenly stopped. After a while, he walked forward in silence. During that day, he didn't talk to White Lotus again. Chapter 528. In fact, most of the time, Lu Chen and White Lotus were not people who were easy to get along with. White Lotus's temperament had been nurtured since she was a child. When she was a child, she must have suffered a lot from the side of the family. But later on, when she was discovered to have a rare innate talent of 5 pillars, she immediately rose to the sky in a single step and became a treasure loved by everyone. When she was accepted as a disciple by Hakushin Jinkun of the Kunlun party, she reached the peak of her life. Everyone was optimistic about her, and everyone thought that this girl would have a bright future in the future. Yuan Zhenren was not a problem, and even the position of deity Zhenren could be expected. At that time, on one hand, White Lotus had the full support of the Bai clan, on the other hand, she had the biggest backer in the Kunlun party, and on the other hand, she had the eldest senior brother, who was the Zhenren of the Kunlun party. Everyone in the Kunlun party, from top to bottom, treated her like a fairy. In addition, she was born beautiful and moving. At a young age, she already had the temperament of a fairy from the 9th heaven. She was the perfect person in the legends. If those things did not happen later, if there was no person called Zhenren Tianlan in this world, presumably, White Lotus would really live a fairy-like life. But now, almost all the dazzling halos on her body had faded. Her master was dead, her senior brother had inexplicably gone into death's seclusion, and there was another senior brother who was even worse, directly defecting to the enemy. Even the Bai clan, who originally regarded her as the future hope of the family's resurgence and had placed unlimited hope on her, suddenly seemed to have become deaf and blind overnight. They completely forgot about her, and almost no longer mentioned her to outsiders. The situation in this world was so cruel, and the gap was so big. It was already very good that White Lotus had not gone crazy and was still struggling to survive. But now, her temper was really like a thorn. Except for bowing her head to the ground in front of the high and mighty Zhenren and disregarding her dignity to survive, she was very cold and harsh to others. Even Lu Chen was the same. From time to time, he would mock and make sarcastic remarks. In comparison, Lu Chen seemed to be in a better state. After so many years of suffering, he had long become tactful. Many times, he would smile when he should laugh, and he would lower his head when he should lower his head. But for some reason, he still gave off a cold sense of distance. He was always far away from people, making it hard for people to see his intentions or thoughts. Or perhaps, he let you see his intentions, but then you would wonder if what you saw was his sincerity. Almost everyone was like that when they were with him. No one could get close to his heart. White Lotus was like that, Su Qingjun was like that, Supreme Tianlan was like that, and even Old Ma, who had spent more than 10 years with him, was like that. Perhaps it was because of this that perfected Lord Tianlan could not completely trust him. When these two people walked together, it would of course be strange if they could get along with each other in harmony and intimacy. After traveling together for a few days, Lu Chen and White Lotus, who were both smart people, quickly understood this point. But for some reason, White Lotus forcibly suppressed her temper and often took the initiative to talk to Lu Chen every day, but the atmosphere of the conversation was often very awkward. Lu Chen's reaction to this was very straightforward. He had already been in this situation, and the girl opposite him was not someone who could suppress him or directly decide his fate. So, Lu Chen had no interest in dealing with her, even if White Lotus was indeed a rare beauty in the world. Lu Chen slipped away. In the dead of night, he ran faster than anyone else with the black dog. He was so unpredictable that even White Lotus could not catch up with him. She could only curse angrily in the dark night. After returning to traveling alone, Lu Chen took Atsu and traveled over mountains and rivers. After several years, he finally returned to the western continent and saw the familiar majestic Kunlun mountain range. The vicissitudes and changes of the world didn't seem to change the appearance of the majestic mountains at all. Perhaps in the eyes of the heaven, earth, mountains, and rivers, this bit of time was only a blink of an eye. But for some people, that fleeting glimmer was their whole life. Lu Chen did not hurry to climb the Kunlun mountain. Instead, he entered Kunwa City. Of course, he was also very familiar with Kunwa City. Many things had happened here. In addition to the love and hatred of those years, he had actually wandered in this city even earlier when he was still a child. Later on, he was discovered and taken away by perfected Lord Tianlan, which led to the circumstances of his life later on. In all of Lu Chen's memories, Kunwa City was actually the starting point of everything. He started his life here. Walking on the familiar streets and looking at the familiar scenery, Lu Chen always had the illusion that everything here had never changed. Not only the streets, shops, and houses, but even the people walking here gave him the feeling that nothing had changed since a long time ago. But this feeling was, of course, wrong. Everything had changed. There were many big mansions in Kunwa City, and the rich and powerful families with a long history all lived here. Along the way, Lu Chen was like an ordinary passerby who saw the lintel of the door and recalled the past. The Bai clan style was still very grand, but the people in front of the door seemed to have become calm and low-key. The Atsu family was obviously a bit dilapidated. Could it be that the owner didn't have the heart to take care of it? The servants at the door were all listless. Even their gazes when looking outside seemed to be drifting, as if they had lost their vitality. Later, Lu Chen stopped in front of a slightly smaller house. From a distance, he looked at the words, "E Manor," hanging on the lintel of the door. He was silent for a long time before he finally sighed softly. In fact, if he really counted it, it hadn't been a long time since Yi Xian passed away, but in Lu Chen's heart, it seemed like many years had passed. But as time passed, the smile of that young girl became increasingly clear in his heart. Time didn't wear away her beauty, it just quietly occupied a corner in his heart, looking at him with a smile and quietly accompanying him. Compared to Yi Xian, many things that happened on that soul-stirring night had faded from Lu Chen's memory. The struggle for power, the cruel fighting, the fine line between life and death, and all kinds of things that changed the fate of the world, everything began to become distant to him. Before coming to Kunwa City, he had already asked old Ma about Yi Xian's situation after he left. In the end, Yi Xian's body was taken back by her family. Her father still loved her very much, and it was said that he was extremely sad. After taking care of Yi Xian's funeral, he fell seriously ill. Although he didn't lose his life, his body wasn't as good as it used to be. Even now, the cause of Yi Xian's death was still unclear. In other words, the real murderer still couldn't be determined. How ridiculous this may sound, but it is the truth. Someone once secretly said that it was related to the dead son of the Su family, Sumo, but it was quickly denied by the Su family. Sumo's mother, Madame Bai, denied it with grief and indignation. She would rather die than let her son's name be tarnished after his death. Her attitude was so resolute that no one else in the Su family said anything. The Yi family went to the Kunlun party to investigate, but in the end, the matter was left unresolved. The Su family was a great aristocratic family, and there were some particularly outstanding people in the Kunlun party who had connections with several Yuanying enlightened masters. Who told them to be a small family that only knew how to grow tea? Even if they had a Yuanying enlightened master in their sect, this wouldn't be the case. However, the Yi family didn't really make a scene because it wouldn't be beneficial to the entire family. Moreover, in some private occasions, some people who couldn't stand it spoke to them. Yi Xian didn't die unjustly. There were people who were furious for her, people who disregarded everything for her, and people who took revenge for her. Revenge was all that mattered. The dead's wish was fulfilled, the living had to continue living. However, this hatred was buried in the heart and passed on to their descendants. One day, it would grow and sprout. That day, Lu Chen stood outside the Yi family's door, filled with emotions. He reminisced about the past, but of course, he wouldn't think about the future. He just wanted to see Yi Xian again. To be precise, he wanted to see the wooden plaque with Yi Xian's name. For some reason, Lu Chen felt a little lost. He remembered how he felt when he returned to Qingshidang village and stood in front of Dingdang's grave. They were all beautiful women in the world, but they were gone. He didn't catch them when they were alive, so after the separation of life and death, all that was left were memories. He turned and left the street, but he didn't go far. He found an inn to stay in and waited until the sky turned dark. After settling Atsu in the room, Lu Chen returned to the Yi family's house and climbed over the wall. Chapter 529. The Yi family's house was the kind that had been around for many years but was still very clean and tidy. It was well organized and well arranged. Although it was not as luxurious as the Su family's by family, it had its own elegant atmosphere. At the same time, the layout of the house was very clear. Lu Chen found the ancestral hall at the back of the Yi family's house without much effort. Most families did not have an ancestral hall. Sometimes, only people with the same surname and clan in a village would have a large ancestral hall to worship their ancestors. To be able to set up a special place in the house to build an ancestral hall, it was basically a first-class family or aristocratic family. The Yi family's ancestors had lived a glorious life, so they had left behind a great legacy. There was also an ancestral hall in the house, but it didn't look very big. It was only in a corner of the house. There was a courtyard and a house with green tiles and white walls. When Lu Chen gently entered the secluded courtyard, the surroundings were quiet. Night shrouded the ancestral hall. Only a few altar lamps could be seen inside the door that was always open according to tradition. Under the dim yellow light, the shadows trembled slightly. On the quiet altar table, there were many memorial tablets with the names of the deceased written on them. Lu Chen stared at the house for a moment, then walked over. However, just as he reached the door and was about to step over the threshold, his body suddenly paused. He stopped at the door. Under the altar lamps, his face flickered in the shadows. He frowned slightly and his gaze sharpened. He turned to look at a corner of the ancestral hall. There was a place where the candlelight could not reach, and there was a wooden chair. There was a vague shadow on the chair, and it seemed that a person was sitting there. The night was quiet. There was no sound from inside or outside the house. Lu Chen did not show any fear or guilt. He just stared at the figure. After a while, the shadow moved. Then, a person stood up and slowly walked over to stand under the light. He looked like an old man with gray hair and a thin face. At the same time, his face looked as calm as an ancient well without any ripples, as if nothing could disturb him anymore. Lu Chen stared at him for a moment. He suddenly realized that the old man's features were somewhat similar to Yi Xian's. He furrowed his brows and pondered for a moment before cupping his hands in salute and taking a step back to show that he had no enmity. Then, he said, "I'm sorry to have disturbed you, Senior." After a pause, he added, "Please don't worry, I'm not a thief." The old man was also looking at him. A stranger had suddenly appeared in his own home, but from start to finish, he did not show any expression of surprise or anger. He only nodded and said, "I know. There is nothing in this ancestral hall. If he was a thief, he would not have come here." Even Lu Chen, who had always been tactful, did not know how to respond. Fortunately, the old man quickly said, "Although our Yi family is a small family, we still have night guards. You must have amazing divine power to be able to sneak in here without alerting anyone. I wonder what your purpose is, could you please tell me? Lu Chen was silent for a moment. I am here to pay my respects to an old friend. I did not want to disturb your family, so I came here in the middle of the night. I am truly ashamed of my inappropriate behavior. I hope Senior can forgive me. The old man seemed surprised and asked, May I ask which ancestor of the Yi family you wish to pay your respects to? Lu Chen hesitated for a moment before answering honestly, Yi Xian. The old man's body trembled slightly and his expression changed slightly. He opened his eyes and stared at Lu Chen for a long time before he suddenly thought of something and said, could it be Lu Chen? Lu Chen was shocked and nodded. Yes, who are you? How do you know me? The old man stared at him for a while and sighed. Please come in. He turned and looked at the memorial tablets on the table. After a moment of silence, he said, I am Yi Ming, Yi Xian's father. In the silent night, darkness shrouded the land. Most people were asleep except for the ancestral hall in the Yi family's backyard. Two men sat facing each other, talking calmly. I've asked around about what happened back then. Although our Yi family is no longer what it used to be, we still have a few acquaintances on Kunlun Mountain. Yi said. Yi Ming said this to Lu Chen. Although he didn't mention any names, Lu Chen understood what he meant. The Yi family was a native of Kunwa City and one of their ancestors was the great Yuanying master. Even though they were weak now, they still had their ways of gathering information. Melaleuca japonica, who took great care of Yi Xian, and Dongfang Tao, who took Yi Xian in as his disciple, were already friends. The ancestral hall wasn't a place to entertain guests, so there naturally wasn't any tea between them. They just sat across from each other. Yi Ming looked at Lu Chen, and after a long moment of silence, he suddenly stood up and solemnly bowed to him. Lu Chen was shocked and hurriedly moved away. Senior, why? Yi Ming smiled bitterly. No matter what, you were the one who avenged Yi Xian back then. The Yi family will always remember this. Lu Chen fell silent. After a while, he said in a low voice, I'm sorry, I couldn't save her. Yi Ming shook his head and turned to walk to the altar table in the ancestral hall. His eyes swept over the memorial tablets and finally stopped on the memorial tablet at the edge. He sighed softly and said, Yi Xian, your friend has come to see you. Lu Chen slowly walked over and looked at the wooden tablet. There was only one simple line of words on it, Daughter Yi Xian's memorial tablet. At that moment, his lips moved, as if countless memories of the past suddenly surged into his mind. Scene after scene flashed past, and then silently dissipated. He turned his head and looked at Yi Ming with a pleading gaze. Yi Ming sighed, nodded, and moved aside. Lu Chen picked up 3 incense sticks from the altar and lit them on the altar lamp. Green smoke floated into the air, creating a dreamy scene. He stared at the memorial tablet behind Xin Yan, as if he could see the bright, kind, and cheerful young girl from back then. A moment later, he held the incense stick in his hand and respectfully bowed 3 times to Yi Xian's memorial tablet, then inserted it into the incense burner on the altar table. The ancestral hall was silent. Only the green smoke floated in the air. Thinking back to one's life, one would probably become like this green smoke after death. He stood there for a long time before bowing to Yi Ming. Thank you for your help, Senior. I cannot thank you enough. Since my wish has been fulfilled, I shall take my leave now. Yi Ming nodded. The Yi family will remember your kindness. If there is anything we can help you with in the future, please don't hesitate to ask. Lu Chen smiled but shook his head. It was not a good thing to be related to him. He cupped his hands at Yi Ming and left the ancestral hall. He leaped into the air and flew into the deep darkness. In the distance, the majestic mountain of Kunlun seemed to be opening its chest in the darkness to welcome the arrival of this stranger. Chapter 530. The night was boundless, and the majestic mountain stood tall. The majestic Kunlun stood tall in the world. No one knew how many years had passed, and how many vicissitudes had it seen. Lu Chen took advantage of the night and swept up the mountain. His figure blended into the darkness, like a shadow that was no different from the surrounding darkness. He passed through quietly and did not alarm any of the patrolling guards. The curfew rule passed down by the Kunlun party for many years was obviously still in effect. In such a famous sect, in the dead of night, except for the disciples who patrolled the mountain, there were almost no other figures. In fact, based on Lu Chen's current status, his position in the Kunlun party could not be underestimated. Just being the only direct disciple of Supreme Tianlan was enough to put him in a position that was second only to one and above tens of thousands of people. After all, in today's Kunlun party, the status of Supreme Tianlan could be said to be supreme, and no one could compare to him. In other words, as long as Supreme Tianlan and Lu Chen were willing, they could announce to the public that Lu Chen had come this time, and the Kunlun party might open the mountain gate to welcome him warmly and hold a welcoming ceremony. However, this time, neither Lu Chen nor Supreme Tianlan had this intention. Instead, they were silent and did not inform the Kunlun party of their actions at all. Taking advantage of the darkness of the night, Lu Chen quietly entered the Kunlun mountain, and Black Dog went with him. They avoided the mysterious patrolling guards of the Kunlun party, went all the way deep, and gradually approached the heart of the Kunlun party. In fact, it was not very easy for ordinary people to sneak into the Kunlun party, but Lu Chen had lived here for many years, and he basically knew the mountains, rivers, and geography of this place. Even Atsu had run wildly in this mountain before. Trekking over mountains and rivers was not a problem for it at all. Instead, it had a sense of familiarity as if it had returned to its hometown. Therefore, it didn't take much effort for the man and the dog to avoid the patrolling guards along the way. From afar, they saw the place known as the Forbidden Area of Kunlun. The once marvelous scenery of the human world, the 4 strange mountains that were floating in mid-air, now only 3 remained. They drew long shadows in the night sky, and the place that had suddenly become empty seemed a little strange and awkward. When he was in Immortal City, Lu Chen had learned about some of the current situation of the Kunlun party from the well-informed old Ma. Of course, there were all kinds of complicated situations and undercurrents, but roughly speaking, Hakushin Jinkuan's forces had been completely erased in the past few years. Everything that used to be related to Hakushin Jinkuan had become a taboo, whether openly or secretly, and no one was willing to mention it. Even the winter peak, which had fallen, and the huge piles of soil and rocks that had fallen to the ground were still piled up on Kunlun Mountain, no one seemed to have seen it anymore. Every day, every time they saw the 3 peaks of spring, summer, and autumn, people only thought that these 3 strange peaks had always existed in the world, and there had never been a 4th peak. That was probably how shallow human relationships were. Or maybe there were some people who still remembered in their hearts that they were not unkind, but the affairs of the world had come to this. In the end, they could not be like a mantis trying to stop a chariot, and they could only go with the wind and dust. As the disciple of Supreme Tianlan, Lu Chen, of course, would not have such worries in his heart. After glancing at the empty night sky expressionlessly, his expression did not change at all, and he continued to move forward. Soon, he and Atsu approached the forbidden area of Kunlun, the place that was shrouded in thick fog all year round. A small mountain that was made up of huge rocks and countless piles of soil was at the edge of the thick fog. Half of it was exposed outside the thick fog, and the other half was covered by the thick fog. In the darkness of the night, this tall mountain stood quietly. One could vaguely see that the mountain was no longer desolate, and a lot of weeds and greenery had grown on it. Life was like this. Even though the winter peak was cold and nothing could grow on it, in the years after the crash, the land that had turned into an ownerless mountain would naturally be covered with greenery after being watered by the wind and rain. Lu Chen glanced at the mountain, but he could no longer see any trace of the majestic and austere mountain from back then. Everything had completely collapsed that night, including the once insufferably arrogant glory, fame, wealth, and majesty. All that was left was the soil that had fallen into the dust in front of him. He expressionlessly turned his head, walked around the mountain, and continued to walk towards the thick fog. However, when he saw that the thick fog was getting closer and closer, Lu Chen suddenly stopped. After thinking for a moment, he turned his head to look at Atsu and said, "You better not go in with me." Atsu looked a little stunned. It tilted its head and looked into the depths of the thick fog, as if it was a little unwilling. However, Lu Chen shook his head and walked over to touch Atsu's head. He whispered, "There are some things inside. No, you don't want to see them. Just wait for me outside." Although Atsu was unwilling, it was very obedient to Lu Chen most of the time. It immediately nodded, wagged its tail, and licked his hand. Lu Chen smiled and hugged it gently. Then, he turned around and took a deep breath before striding into the thick fog. The fog engulfed Lu Chen's figure in the blink of an eye. At this time, it was more and more obvious that this place was strange. The land was so close, but there seemed to be an invisible boundary or a transparent high wall in the void. The fog was always gathered on the side of the boundary, and no matter what, it would not cross the boundary. The gray and tall fog wall blocked all the prying eyes. Even Atsu couldn't see the situation in the fog. After Lu Chen went inside, it was as if he suddenly disappeared from this world. There was no sound or movement. Atsu waited in the same place for a long time, and gradually began to feel a little bored. It turned its head and looked around. Then, its gaze fell on the earthen mountain not far away. In the night, the mountain formed by the collapsed winter peak looked like it was cut in half by the fog. The exposed half of the mountain looked very ugly and steep. Suddenly, Atsu seemed to be startled. It raised its head and looked up. At the top of the mountain far away, in the darkness where the thick fog intersected, there was suddenly a glimmer of light. It was like a shadow, swaying in the dark night. Atsu stared at the dark high place. After a while, it took the first step forward and began to slowly climb up the mountain. The mountain was steep, and the terrain was dangerous. Although many places were covered with grass and trees, there were still some dangerous places. It was easy for sand and stones to roll down, and if one was not careful, one would fall from the high place. However, Atsu was obviously very good at this. It walked all the way, jumping and running, and gradually approached the top of the mountain. Then, in the thick fog not far in front of it, Atsu's body suddenly trembled. In the thick fog, it suddenly saw a pair of huge eyes in front of it. Even the darkness could not block the light in the eyes, staring at it coldly. Above and below the mountain, in the shadow of the night, it was silent. Chapter 531. The cold wind blew, and the thick fog rolled and drifted, but it always stayed on the other side of the invisible boundary line, which looked very strange. In particular, the pair of eyes that had suddenly appeared in the mist on top of this mountain made one's scalp tingle. They were dark and mysterious. Atsu took a step back, but it did not have the intention to turn around and run away. Instead, it stared at the pair of eyes, which seemed to be very bold and fearless. After a while, Atsu let out a few deep roars, but it wasn't the kind that was threatening. Instead, it seemed to have a hint of inquiry and verification. The thick fog floated slowly, and after a while, a strange sound suddenly came from the fog. Moo! Atsu's eyes immediately lit up. There was actually some excitement on his face as he took a few steps forward. Not long after, the thick fog shook, and then a huge body slowly appeared from the fog. It was a huge oxen. On Mount Kunlun, the territory of the Kunlun party, such a huge oxen could enter and exit the forbidden area of Kunlun unscrupulously without any harm. Needless to say, it could only be the special oxen of Supreme Tianlan. Atsu grinned. It had not seen this oxen for many years, but it did not seem to be too unfamiliar with this oxen. It ran up quickly and circled around this oxen a few times, barking, and excitedly stretched out its front paw to pat oxen's belly a few times. Of course, oxen should also recognize this big black dog. Although when Atsu was still in Mount Kunlun, it was still a weak native dog, but oxen was still oxen. It had helped Atsu once, so it naturally had good taste. At this moment, facing the very happy Atsu, oxen looked more like a somewhat gratified but still calm big boss. It did not show much excessive excitement, but oxen did not dislike Atsu's excited behavior. At most, it looked at it helplessly with a little tolerance. Moo! Oxen let out a cry and walked out of the fog completely. Then, like before, it found a flat place on the earthen hill and lay down on its stomach, as if it had become a part of the earthen hill. Atsu followed, still looking very excited. It chased after Oxen and kept barking, until Oxen's tail suddenly stood up and patted its head a few times. Atsu shrunk its head, and only then did it calm down. In fact, after a few years, Atsu's appearance had also changed greatly. In terms of body shape, the mutated black dog was not much different from Oxen. However, this Oxen's aura was too strong. Wherever it went, it had the appearance of a king. Any creature in front of it would feel like they were a head shorter than it, which was why Atsu was still a little short. Oxen lay on the top of the earthen hill and looked into the distance. In the depths of the night, Kunlun mountain range was undulating, and everything was quiet and normal as usual. However, now that there was a black dog by his side, and thinking about its origin, it was definitely not normal. Moo. This time, Oxen was looking at the black dog, and there was a trace of doubt in its voice. Atsu hesitated for a moment, and then it probably thought of the identity and background of this giant beast in front of it, so it decisively betrayed Lu Chen. It stretched out one of its front legs and pointed in a certain direction at the foot of the mountain. Oxen rolled its eyes, but it had no intention of interfering. It still lay on the ground and did not move. This made Atsu, who originally wanted to follow this big boss beast into the thick fog to have a look, a little disappointed. It could not help but let out a few soft barks. Oxen did not pay attention to it, and seemed to have something on its mind. At that moment, it seemed to inadvertently look up into the sky. In the depths of the thick fog, there seemed to be a huge shadow swaying in the rolling fog, but it quickly disappeared into the depths of the fog. At this moment, suddenly, Oxen's eyes focused, and it turned its head to look at the bottom of the earthen hill. At the same time, Atsu seemed to have felt something, and at the same time, it walked to Oxen's side and looked down. In the silent night, a figure suddenly walked over from afar. Her clothes fluttered in the night wind, and her face was beautiful, like a fairy who had descended from the moon. It was White Lotus. In the night, Oxen and Black Dog did not make a sound, nor did they do anything else. They just quietly watched the girl come closer. White Lotus seemed to be very cautious, and her brows were slightly furrowed. She was also very wary of her surroundings, and from time to time, she would look around. However, perhaps it was because of the angle of her line of sight, she did not seem to notice the two animals on the earthen hill. Just like that, she slowly walked around the foot of the earthen hill, and then stood in front of the thick fog. She stared at the wall of thick fog, and a complicated expression appeared on her face, and she began to daydream. Should I go in, or not? On the earthen hill, Oxen turned its head to look at Black Dog, and Atsu immediately shook its head, indicating that it did not know this person at all. It was the kind of person that had no relationship with him, and was very certain of it. Then, Atsu's eyes turned, and it moved closer to Oxen's huge horn with its head, as if it was trying to encourage the mysterious and unpredictable Ox King of Kunlun to teach the arrogant girl a lesson for trespassing into the forbidden area. Oxen looked at it, and after a moment of hesitation, it slowly stood up. Atsu was instantly happy, and it wagged its tail, and grinned silently. Of course, it was Lu Chen's first time coming to this forbidden area of Kunlun. Even though he had lived in the Kunlun party for many years, and had a secret special relationship with Lord Tianlan, he had always stayed away from places that would easily attract attention, and that was also the instinct of a shadow. However, now that he had a special mission from Lord Tianlan, the situation was naturally different. Although he had never entered this mysterious place shrouded in thick fog, since Lord Tianlan had sent him here, he would naturally have some instructions. Therefore, Lu Chen already had a good idea of the situation of this forbidden area between the clouds and the sky. For example, he now knew that the destination of his trip was not just in this thick fog. What was hidden in the thick fog was just a secret entrance. The biggest secret of the Kunlun sect, a 1,000-year-old sect, was actually hidden in the mysterious underground palace deep under the ground. To be honest, when he first heard this secret from Lord Tianlan, Lu Chen's heart reacted almost instantly, and he thought of the mysterious underground palace under the immortal city. Although the two were very different, he did not know why, but he suddenly linked the two places together. Was it finally time for the secrets hidden under the dust of time to reveal their true faces one by one? Lu Chen walked slowly, and the surrounding fog automatically moved away from him. It was as if there was some strange thing or strange power on his body that could disperse the fog, as well as the strange things in the fog that couldn't be explained clearly. Then, he walked all the way to the center of the thick fog, and saw that place. Chapter 532. Lu Chen took out something from his bosom. It was a golden seal the size of half a palm. The golden seal was golden in color and radiated in all directions. The radiance that it emitted carried a sense of solemnity and solemnity. There was actually a faint aura of a king. When Lu Chen took out the golden seal and placed it on his palm, it was as if it had broken free from its shackles. The golden radiance immediately shot out in all directions. The radiance was so dazzling that it even made Lu Chen's face look like it was smeared with a layer of faint gold leaf. He had transformed into the golden statue of a deity in the temple. The dense fog that was originally entrenched and rolling in the surroundings suddenly retreated. Wherever the golden radiance passed, the fog that could not disperse in time was directly fixed by the radiance. Then, it forcibly evaporated and disappeared. In that short period of time, one could still vaguely hear some low, frightened, mournful screams bursting out from the depths of the thick fog. They were filled with despair and fear. Wherever the golden radiance passed, there seemed to be no dark corners that could be hidden. Lu Chen stared at the golden seal in his palm. There was a trace of a complicated expression on his face. He gently rubbed it. From his fingertips, he felt that it was hard to the touch. On top of the golden seal was carved a lifelike golden dragon. It bared its fangs and brandished its claws. It had a powerful and imposing aura. Its glaring eyes seemed to have a power that looked down on the world. When he gently turned the golden seal over, he saw that under the square seal base, there was only one word engraved: heaven. This golden seal was, of course, a treasure. Moreover, it was a unique treasure in the heavenly realm. However, the people in the world who knew of its existence were as rare as phoenix feathers and unicorn horns. To be exact, for thousands of years, there had never been more than 2 people who knew of this golden seal. Many years ago, this golden seal was called the Tianshou seal. It was said that the original meaning was, to live as long as the heavens. Later on, someone gave it another name. It was called the Kunlun seal. Legend has it that this golden seal was forged from the essence of the majestic Kunlun mountain range by the gods of ancient times. It was the essence of the mountains, the crystallization of the earth. Then, this treasure suddenly disappeared from history, never to be seen again. Or perhaps it had appeared before, but other than the owner of the treasure, everyone else who saw it was dead. Yes, since ancient times, this Kunlun seal had always been silently passed down among the inheritors of the heavenly Daoist name, and it had never been shown to the outside world, even to those of the same sect who were as close as brothers. From Tianhong to Tianlan, and from Tianlan to Tianying. These words were said by perfected Lord Tianlan to Lu Chen. That day, when he handed the Kunlun seal to Lu Chen, perfected Lord Tianlan's expression seemed so relaxed, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He looked at Lu Chen with a smile and an expression that seemed to be filled with an indescribable trust. What else could prove perfected Lord Tianlan's sincerity better than this? With the Kunlun seal and the knowledge of the ancient secrets, one could freely enter and exit the forbidden area of Kunlun. One could also know and master the biggest secret in the history of the Kunlun party. If this wasn't trust, then what was trust? If this wasn't regarding him as an inheritor and wanting to entrust everything to him, then what was? Lu Chen clenched the golden seal in his hand. He looked at the scene in front of him, which was almost exactly the same as what perfected Lord Tianlan had said. There was no change at all. He frowned, and for the first time, a hint of doubt slowly appeared on his face. Could it be that the damn Baldy, was he really sincere to him? Was everything he said true? Could it be that all this time, his unshakable wariness towards this person was actually all wrong? Lu Chen silently stared at the ground in front of him. Countless scenes of the past flashed through his mind, but he temporarily put them to the back of his mind. The golden seal's light flowed and flickered. An invisible force spread out. Then, without a sound, a bottomless hole that led to the dark and deep underground appeared in that mysterious land. He still had something to do. The biggest secret hidden in the Kunlun Mountains was the purpose of his trip. He clenched the Kunlun seal in his hand, took a deep breath, and then jumped down. The hole was very deep and very dark. He couldn't even see his fingers in front of him. However, the golden light of the Kunlun seal could illuminate the surroundings. Therefore, Lu Chen saw that even in this deep underground cave, there was still a dense fog. Behind the fog, there seemed to be more mysterious and strange things, bigger and scarier. Those things seemed to be sentient. They sensed that someone had suddenly intruded into this mysterious place. Therefore, they were all angry, or rather, they were all ecstatic and excited. Countless thick fog surged wildly and swarmed toward Lu Chen from all directions. It was as if the omnipresent darkness was laughing and roaring, wanting to devour everything. Until the golden light stopped in front of the fog. The golden light was like the solemnity of an emperor, blocking all the darkness 3 feet away. Wherever the light reached, the darkness turned into ashes. The things in the darkness roared furiously, but no matter what, they didn't dare to get close to the golden light. Lu Chen looked at the terrible scene around him expressionlessly. As he fell faster and faster, the surrounding dark fog began to appear with lightning-like silver lights. They tore through the darkness and wandered in every corner of the fog like ghosts. Sometimes they disappeared, sometimes they burst out, as if they had moved all the thunder in the sky into this abyss. When Lu Chen fell, all of a sudden, all the electric lights soared into the air, and suddenly there was a shrill and creepy sound in the air. At that moment, the golden light was suddenly compressed, and suddenly rolled back to less than a foot away from Lu Chen. The wind whistled, and the thick fog pressed forward. When it was so close, it was as if there was only darkness in front of him, as if there was a devil opening its terrifying mouth in front of him. Behind him, above him, and in all directions, he was surrounded by the evil spirits in the fog. The next moment, he would be torn apart. Lu Chen closed his eyes and no longer looked at the terrible scene around him. He just tightened his grip on the Kunlun seal in his hand. The dazzling golden light once again became bright. Although it was slow but steady, it slowly expanded in all directions. Countless low growls, with disappointment and resentment, came from the darkness, and then slowly went away. The electric lights disappeared, the terrifying power that could make people crazy dissipated. The darkness became silent again, and then Lu Chen's falling speed also suddenly began to slow down. Breathing deeply, Lu Chen once again opened his eyes. Those terrible scenes seemed to be left in the darkness above his head, and no longer appeared in front of his eyes. Only he himself knew that his back was already drenched in sweat. In those dangerous moments before, if he slightly relaxed and lost his mind, what awaited him would probably be a fate that was more painful than death. His speed gradually slowed down, and the surroundings also gradually became spacious. After an unknown period of time, the Kunlun seal brought Lu Chen, and slowly landed on a piece of land. Just what kind of secret was hidden in the depths of this unknown depth? Lu Chen let out a long breath, but without any hesitation, he held the Kunlun seal in his palm, and continued to walk forward. In the distant depths of the darkness, there was a vague shadow of a huge door, faintly discernible in the darkness. Chapter 533. The figure of the girl at the foot of the hill had been standing in front of the thick fog. She did not turn around to leave, nor did she walk into the fog. On top of the hill, oxen and black dog were lying side by side, looking down with a strange look in their eyes. After a while, White Lotus suddenly moved. She lifted one of her feet and seemed to want to walk forward. On top of the hill, oxen and black dog immediately raised their heads and looked at White Lotus in surprise. Atsu even stood up. White Lotus leaned forward and was about to walk forward, but her foot suddenly stopped in midair. Then, no one knew what she was thinking, but she silently retracted her foot. She stood in the same place and began to stare blankly, not moving for a long time. This confused the two animals on the hill. Atsu turned its head and looked at Oxen. Oxen also had a puzzled look in its eyes. It probably did not understand what the girl at the foot of the hill was trying to do. Atsu could not hold it in any longer. He approached the green ox and muttered a few words to it in a low voice. The green ox glared at him and shook its huge head. However, it lay down again, as if it did not intend to do anything. Atsu looked in the direction of the thick fog and seemed to be a little anxious. It then looked down at the foot of the hill. Unexpectedly, White Lotus, who was standing in front of the thick fog and seemed to be hesitating whether to go in or not, suddenly took a few steps back without saying a word. It seemed like she had given up on going in. However, White Lotus's eyes were still on the thick fog in front of her. Occasionally, she would look up at the remaining 3 strange peaks that were still floating high in the sky. The light in her eyes was dim and difficult to see. Atsu looked back and forth, and finally, it seemed like it could not stand it anymore. It was either curious or worried about Lu Chen, who had walked into the thick fog and disappeared. It turned around and looked at the fog for a while, then slowly and tentatively walked over. The place it walked to was the corner of the hill that Oxen had walked out of from the thick fog. It looked no different from its surroundings, at least from outside the thick fog. Behind it, the green ox seemed to have sensed something as well. It silently turned its head and glanced at Atsu's back. Standing in front of the thick fog, Atsu only felt that everything in front of it was gray, vague, and unfathomable. There seemed to be a kind of faintly frightening atmosphere in front of it. However, the fact that Lu Chen had walked in and Oxen had also walked out of it probably gave Atsu a lot of courage. Therefore, Atsu did not hesitate for too long. It tentatively raised its foot and stretched out its foot into the thick fog. Dog leg. The front of the dog's paw touched the fog. Just like all the fog in the world, Atsu's foot entered it without feeling anything. The thick fog in front of it was not like the terrible poisonous miasma in the legends, where anything that touched it would immediately be poisoned and turn into a pool of yellow water. Everything seemed to be normal. Except for the fact that the fog was a little thicker, it seemed to be harmless to Atsu. After a few attempts, Atsu suddenly became bold. It turned around and barked at Oxen, then walked forward. However, it did not notice that behind it, Oxen was looking at it as if it was looking at a fool. Atsu was very happy and proud. After its body entered the thick fog, it found that nothing had happened. Everything was safe. Then it wagged its tail and turned around. It proudly poked its head out of the fog and barked at Oxen. It seemed to be saying hello, but it also seemed to be saying something like, "Look at me." Oxen looked at it quietly with a strange look in its eyes. Atsu grinned. Just as it was about to show off a few more times, its face suddenly froze. It seemed to have felt something. A moment later, a trace of panic suddenly flashed across its eyes. However, before it could react, it saw the thick fog around it suddenly rolled rapidly from all directions and suddenly surrounded it. Atsu whined, and then its whole body seemed to be suddenly lifted into the air. Then, with a swoosh, the dog's head, which was the only thing left outside the fog, was suddenly dragged into the thick fog. Only a faint hole was left, and then it was immediately filled by the surrounding fog. In the depths of the thick fog far away, the angry and panicked barks of the black dog could be vaguely heard. Oxen rolled its eyes and seemed to sigh helplessly. Then it stood up and slowly walked into the thick fog, step by step, into the depths of the fog. About 10 feet away from the thick fog, White Lotus, who was hesitating and pacing back and forth, suddenly raised her head and looked in front of her with a somewhat surprised expression. At that moment, when she was hesitating and struggling in her heart, she suddenly seemed to hear a strange sound coming from the depths of the thick fog in front of her. It seemed to be a scream, a little panicked and a little shrill. Perhaps it was because of this that White Lotus actually could not tell what it was. Was it a human, a beast, or one of those mysterious spirits and ghosts in the legends? This thick fog sealed off the forbidden area of the Kunlun party. For many years, the Kunlun party had forbidden ordinary disciples to come here. In other words, great cultivators who were above the level of Jinren Yuanying would have some opportunities to go to the 4 strange peaks above the clouds in the sky to cultivate. However, this place on the ground seemed to have always been a place that only the few people with the highest status could enter. In other words, in the past 100 years, it seemed that the only people who could set foot in the forbidden area of Kunlun were Lord Tianlan and her deceased master Hakushin Jinkuan. Until today, there was a third person. Lu Chen. Carrying the strange order secretly given by Lord Tianlan, White Lotus of course knew that the final destination of Lu Chen's journey to the west was the forbidden area of Kunlun. Therefore, although she was cunningly thrown off by Lu Chen halfway, she was very angry but not flustered. She directly returned to the Kunlun party and sneaked into the vicinity of the forbidden area of Kunlun Mountain. After waiting patiently for a period of time, as expected, Lu Chen also came here with Black Dog. However, along the way, the matter of probing Lu Chen that was originally given to her by Lord Tianlan had completely failed. If it failed, then so be it. Anyway, when the time came, she just had to find a way to evade it. Otherwise, there was no better way. However, the forbidden area of Kunlun in front of her made White Lotus feel a little conflicted. Many years ago, when she was still a disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan, she lived on the winter peak of the 4 strange peaks. At that time, she looked down from the sky. Of course, she could see the thick fog on a sunny day. She used to be curious about what was in the forbidden area. However, now that time had passed, even the winter peak had been destroyed in the mountain. Naturally, the feelings of the past were no longer there. Even if it was her, she was just a pitiful person who lived under someone else's roof and had to rely on someone else. But what secret was hidden in this thick fog? Judging from the solemnity of the Kunlun party, there must be a big secret in it. Then, could this secret be an opportunity that she longed for? No matter who it was, falling from the high clouds to the dust all of a sudden, from a proud daughter of heaven to a puppet whose life and death were in the hands of someone else, everyone would feel indignant and want to break free. No matter how big the price was, they would be willing to pay. White Lotus's expression kept changing. Then, she could not help but slowly approach the thick fog. In the next moment, she suddenly gritted her teeth, and then she strode forward and walked into the mist as well. She was walking towards her unknown fate. Chapter 534. In the dead of night, the Kunlun Mountains, shrouded in darkness, looked like a giant who had fallen asleep. The Kunlun party's curfew had been passed down for many years, and it hadn't changed to this day. In the pitch-black night, most places were shrouded in darkness. Except for the Kunlun party's sect leader, a certain corner of the Xingyang Hall where the sect leader of the Kunlun party resided. The current Kunlun party's acting sect leader, the Thousand Lantern sect leader, was still awake. He was sitting in front of a desk with a lit candle on it. The candle was covered with a delicately crafted lampshade, allowing the dim candlelight to illuminate the area around him. It also illuminated his solemn and indifferent expression. The Kunlun party had been established for thousands of years. Naturally, it had already seen countless worldly affairs in the world. Occasionally, an accident happened to the sect leader, and the sect would nominate a temporary sect leader to take over the position. But of the people sitting in this position, he was probably the only one who hadn't removed the word acting from his title for so long. Under the candlelight, there was nothing on the smooth and flat table. There was only a letter placed in front of the Thousand Lantern sect leader. The Thousand Lantern sect leader's gaze fell on the letter. There were a few lines of words on it, heavy and powerful, with an extraordinary bearing. The meaning between the lines was also very simple. In the next few days, the strength of the patrolling guards on Kunlun Mountains should be relaxed. There wasn't even a signature at the end of the letter, and the words between the lines were all direct narration without any honorifics. Although he didn't scold or hurl insults, his words were straightforward, and there was a faint condescending and superior tone that seemed to be on the verge of bursting out. The Thousand Lantern sect leader looked at the letter expressionlessly. He read the words on the letter word by word. He didn't know how many times he had read it, but his face was gloomy. Suddenly, he stood up, turned around, and walked towards the door. In the middle of this, his wide sleeve brushed across the table. When it slid down the table, the letter on the table had already disappeared. Pushing the door open, the Thousand Lantern sect leader walked into the darkness. In the deep night, there was only darkness around him. There wasn't a shadow of a person. Even he himself looked like a ghostly shadow walking in the night, moving forward alone. The cold night wind blew past. He passed through the corridors and walked along the stone path, walking further and further into the night. He did not meet anyone along the way, because he had secretly arranged for the night patrol guards to be sent away. People's moods change, don't they? Thinking back to when he first ascended to the throne, he was full of ambition and looked down on everyone. He felt that his achievements were so brilliant, that his 100 years of forbearance were not in vain. Once he grasped great power in one day, he would be filled with great ambition and ambition. He would definitely make a peerless achievement, make the people of the world look at him, make tens of thousands of people respect him, and make the majestic Kunlun successive generations of founding masters sigh with admiration and pride. Only in this way could he live his life in vain. Only in this way would he be worthy of his abilities, and he wouldn't have wasted so many years of suffering. A cold night breeze blew over, brushing past his cheeks. The chill was like a knife. Qian Dangzhenren's footsteps slowed down. He looked at the sky, the corner of his eyes slightly twitching, but there was grief and indignation in his eyes. But who would have thought that things would turn out like this? His ambition was empty, and he carried the title of sect leader spiritual master in vain. But how many disciples and how many forces in the sect could not work together until today? Each one of them secretly colluded, each one of them paid lip service, and each one of them opposed in secret. Even the two words acting sect leader spiritual master, in front of his head, in a flash of many years, unexpectedly no one proposed to remove it. Why was this? That year when he first ascended to the throne, he sat upright on the high platform, majestic and solemn. Every day when he walked through the sect, the disciples who saw him would respectfully salute him, calling him sect leader spiritual master. How comfortable and happy was that? Even if he carried a solemn expression on his face, his heart was truly happy. But now? So many years had passed, but the two words acting still existed in his title, and his mood had also changed drastically. The disciples who met him in the past were still respectful when they saw him, and even the way they addressed him didn't change. But in his heart, there was no longer the slightest bit of happiness. Qian Dangzhenren couldn't help but secretly think in his heart, these people, these seemingly respectful disciples, every time they saw him and addressed him respectfully, were they laughing in their hearts? Were they secretly ridiculing him, the acting sect leader spiritual master who had held the position for the longest time in history? Every day, Qian Dangzhenren felt that his days were beginning to become torment, because he constantly discovered that everyone under the heavens, didn't respect him very much. In everyone's hearts, the Kunlun party still had a real emperor, and that was the true existence that everyone revered. That person was like a sun, burning fiercely, radiating boundless light, suppressing all other radiance, so that everyone could only see him. Even the sect leader spiritual master, who was supposed to be the highest leader of the Kunlun party, was overshadowed in front of him. This matter shouldn't have been like this. Qian Dangzhenren stopped in his tracks. In this boundless night, he passed through the curtain of night and finally arrived at the foot of a dark mountain. There was a tightly shut cave abode there, and the entrance was overgrown with weeds, as if it had long been abandoned. Qian Dangzhenren quietly stood at the entrance of the cave abode, a trace of hesitation and doubt in his eyes. But when he clenched his hands in his wide sleeves, he touched another light object. It was like a letter that was as light as a feather. But for Qian Dangzhenren, that letter was perhaps as heavy as Mount Tai. He took a deep breath, threw all his worries to the back of his mind, and quietly walked over. The abandoned cave abode's stone door was tightly shut, but traces of the restrictions could still be faintly seen. But for Qian Dangzhenren, who had grasped many of Kunlun's secrets, this was no problem at all. He easily unlocked the restrictions, and as the heavy stone door opened, he walked in. Darkness extended ahead, but the air was unexpectedly not oppressive and oppressive. It should be because this place had maintained good ventilation for many years. After walking through the dark passage, there seemed to be a somewhat oppressive light coming from the depths of the cave abode. At the same time, in the depths of the dark shadows, behind the light, there seemed to be a voice that lightly coughed and let out a sigh. Qian Dangzhenren looked in that direction, and without further hesitation, he directly walked over. The darkness clustered around his figure as he walked into the depths of the cave, and he saw the source of the light. It was a bright pearl embedded in the rock stratum above his head, emitting a faint glimmer. Behind the light was a stone bed, and a figure was sitting on it without moving at all, as if he was a wooden statue. A few chains that were suspended in the shadows were deeply nailed into the incomparably hard stone wall. At the same time, with the help of the faint light, one could see the strange runes on the chains. The light was flickering, and a strong aura of magic power was constantly emitting from them. The figure in the shadows slowly raised his head and glanced at Qian Dangzhenren. Qian Dangzhenren's expression was complicated as he stared at the darkness. After a moment, he sighed and said, "Long time no see, senior brother." Chapter 535. The face of the person in the shadows was a bit indistinct. His long hair draped over his shoulders, but he didn't appear unkempt. His clothes could also be considered neat and tidy, as if he had lived in seclusion for a long time. He raised his head and looked at Thousand Lantern, who had just walked in. His eyes faintly flickered in the darkness outside of the luminous pearl's light. After a while, the person's body moved as if he wanted to get up, but a strange sound suddenly came from his surroundings. The iron chains hidden in the shadows trembled, and several of the strange runes that were filled with the aura of spiritual power lit up. As a result, he quickly sat back down and let out a muffled groan as if he was in pain. But he quickly regained his composure and nodded to Thousand Lantern. "Long time no see, junior brother Thousand Lantern. It's inconvenient for me to move around here and I can't get up to greet you. You can do as you please." Thousand Lantern Daoist was speechless. He looked around and saw that there wasn't even a stone bench in the stone room. Even if there was a stone bench, it probably wouldn't be of any use. After a moment of silence, he walked over to the side of the stone bed where the figure was. He didn't care about the dust that fell from the bed and just sat down on the edge of the stone bed. At this moment, the distance between Thousand Lantern Daoist and that figure was only about an arm's length. That person had been sitting in the shadows and looking at Thousand Lantern Daoist. He seemed to be very calm and didn't show any signs of anger. Instead, he looked at Thousand Lantern Daoist's expression and suddenly smiled. Then he said, "What's wrong? You look like you've encountered something difficult." Daoist Qian Dang's hands were hidden in his sleeves. Because of the position he was sitting in, half of his face was exposed to the light of the luminous pearl, while the other half was hidden in the shadows. At first glance, he seemed to be divided into two halves by the light and the darkness. Black and white were distinct, but his expression was uncertain. After hearing the question from the person in the shadows, Thousand Lantern was silent for a moment before replying, "I didn't think that sitting in this position would be so difficult." The man stared blankly for a moment. He probably didn't expect Thousand Lantern Daoist to say such a thing to him. After a while, he smiled bitterly and shook his head without saying anything. Daoist Master Qian Dang asked again, "Xixiang, when you were the sect leader, did you have the same feeling as me?" "That's right." In the entire Kunlun party, the only person whom Daoist Master Qian Dang would address as senior brother was the former sect leader Daoist Master, who was now forced to go into seclusion due to severe injuries. In the past, his name had shaken the world, but today, he was a prisoner, unable to see the light of day, and dying without a sound. If it was anyone else, perhaps such a fortuitous encounter would drive them insane. However, perfected idle month seemed to be able to remain calm. From the beginning to the end, his expression and words did not change much. After hearing Daoist Master Qian Dang's words, he pondered for a moment before replying in a soft voice, "You have martial uncle Tianlan above you now, but when I was in your position, there were two great gods, my master and martial uncle Tianlan above me." Daoist Master Qian Deng was silent. After a while, he turned his head to look at Perfected Idol Month. In the darkness, Perfected Idol Month also looked at him. Their gazes met, and a moment later, they both smiled bitterly. Looking at such a situation, probably no one would have thought that on a certain full moon night a few years ago, the two of them would be archenemies who couldn't coexist like fire and water. You didn't come here today just to vent your grievances to me, did you? Is there anything else? Perfected Idol Month asked. Daoist Master Qian Deng frowned and pondered. His eyes swept over the inconspicuous but frightening dark chains around Perfected Idol Month. After a while, he said softly, "When I rose up, I wanted to get rid of you, and I also wanted to sit in the position of sect master. The expectations of generations of masters of Bai Chao Tang are all on me, and I must do it." Perfected Idol Month nodded and said, "I understand." The corner of Daoist Master Qian Deng's eyes seemed to twitch slightly, and then he said, "But I thought about killing you, but I didn't think he would imprison and torture you like this. I really don't understand why he didn't just kill you directly." Daoist Master Idol Moon also became silent. Perhaps it was because the he mentioned by Daoist Master Qian Deng was too powerful and carried a boundless and terrifying pressure. Even though he wasn't here, the two of them still felt suffocated and oppressed. He just sighed and said with a wry smile, "Martial Uncle's heart is as deep as the sea. Who knows what he is thinking?" Daoist Master Qian Deng was silent for a while, and then he said, "I once asked Martial Uncle Tianlan about this. He told me that since ancient times, there have been many internal conflicts in the Kunlun party, but there has never been a case of killing a sect master." Perfected Idol Month was stunned, and then he shook his head with a wry smile. After he finished speaking, Daoist Master Qian Deng's expression was similar to Perfected Idol Month's. Of course, such words had no credibility. Since ancient times, the Kunlun party had never killed a perfected cultivator of Huashan realm in an internal conflict. Then what about Hakushin Jinkuan? Perfected Idol Month closed his eyes, looking quiet and serene. Even though he was not free at the moment, he still looked a little like the solemn and dignified old days. After a while, he lowered his voice and said, "Junior brother Qian Deng, if you have anything to ask me, just ask. I'm already like this, so why can't I say it?" Daoist Master Qian Deng frowned and looked at Perfected Idol Month with some hesitation. But after a while, he seemed to think of all the shackles of time in the past few years, and finally, he slowly leaned toward Perfected Idol Month. "Senior brother, you've been the sect master for many years. How much do you know about the forbidden area under the clouds in the sky behind the mountain?" The soft and low voice began to echo in this unknown and dark cave. It was always easy to get lost in the dark. Sometimes, they would lose their direction. Sometimes, they would lose their sense of time. Sometimes, they would even lose themselves. They would feel that everything in the past was wrong. However, when they wanted to choose a new path, they would either find that it was too late, or they would see only darkness in front of them. There was no light at all. When Lu Chen walked in the darkness, in the silence, his mind inexplicably recalled the first half of his life. Like a shadow, he often lived in the dark and walked behind the light until one day, he personally shattered the darkness. He had never regretted it, and he could not regret it. Because when he stabbed Yun Shouyang's back with his saber, he was destined to have no way out. He was a shadow, but he was destined to belong to the light. He raised his head and stopped walking. The huge door appeared in front of him. The golden light of the Kunlun seal sprinkled on the ancient door, as if it was narrating the dust-laden history of the past. He silently looked at it and then walked forward. For some reason, the darkness here was especially thick, and even the golden light could not force back the shadow. Therefore, when looking from the back, one could clearly see that Lu Chen was walking out of the darkness with the golden seal, and step by step, he walked into the depths of the darkness until the darkness completely swallowed his figure and then disappeared without a trace. Boom! In the depths of the distant darkness, there seemed to be a low and deep sound, as if a heavy door had opened a small gap and then slowly closed. Chapter 536. Lu Chen had already discovered that the darkness he was in was different from the darkness he had been in before. The darkness here was particularly thick. Although people did not feel any discomfort in it, the oppressive feeling was unusually obvious. If all the darkness of the night in the human world was like a thin veil of mist, once a light shone, it would retreat calmly and quietly. But at this moment, inside and outside this ancient and huge door, the darkness here was so thick that even the light seemed to be swallowed. There was light in the darkness. It came from the Kunlun seal in Lu Chen's hand. The golden light was still flickering, but it was different from when he was walking in the thick fog on the ground. At that time, when the fog encountered the Kunlun seal, it was as if it was facing a great enemy, like a tiger, and they all avoided it. But in this underground ancient cave, especially when Lu Chen walked behind this huge ancient door, the darkness had been silently lingering around him. Even the golden light of the Kunlun seal could only illuminate a small area nearby. A little further away, the light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, silently disappearing into the shadows. Lu Chen also heard the muffled sound of a door closing behind him. He knew that the ancient door had closed behind him. From this moment onwards, everything suddenly became quiet, and there was only darkness in front of him where he couldn't even see his own fingers. Lu Chen took 2 steps back, and his back leaned against the incomparably hard door. A cold air seeped into his body through his clothes. For some reason, Lu Chen's body suddenly trembled, and then he discovered that the black flame hidden in his Dantian sea of qi suddenly jumped, as if it was stimulated by something, or perhaps it was awakened by something, and it slowly burned. In his eyes in the darkness, 2 clusters of black flames began to appear and burn fiercely. Lu Chen was taken aback. He quickly recalled that a few years ago, when he was still in the Kunlun party, the black fire in his body was suddenly awakened. He was also very shocked at that time, but he could not figure out where the black fire in his body, which was similar to the black fire in his body but had an obviously primitive and ancient aura, came from. Until today, he suddenly understood that the source of that power was here. In the depths of Kunlun Mountain, apart from the things that Supreme Lord Tianlan had told him in private, there was another side to the great secret that had been hidden for 1,000 years. His expression became somewhat strange and wonderful in the darkness, and an indescribable feeling emerged in his heart. After standing still for a moment, Lu Chen finally made up his mind and began to walk forward. The darkness was as deep as the sea, completely obscuring one's vision. As far as the eye could see, there was almost no light except for the Kunlun seal in his hand. Lu Chen could not see anything more than a foot around him. In the darkness, this place could be as wide as the sea, or as narrow as a shack. If he took one more step, he would hit the wall. Every step was taken very carefully, because in such darkness, he did not know whether his next step would be empty, whether he would step on a trap, or whether something strange would happen. However, from another angle, in a vast and empty space of darkness that had suddenly been magnified countless times, something moved slightly in the darkness. Looking up, the glimmer of light in the distance was swaying in the dark sea, slowly walking over. Lu Chen did not know how long he had walked, or how far he had walked, but in his perception, he seemed to have walked very far, and a lot of time had passed. However, he clearly remembered that on the night before he left Mount Celestial Dragon, Supreme Lord Tianlan had clearly told him that in this place, all his perceptions could be wrong. This place was different from the entire cultivation world of the Divine Land. This place was unique in this world, this was the territory of that thing. In any case, Lu Chen still felt that he had walked for a very long time, and he felt a little tired. However, he immediately realized that this feeling of fatigue should not have appeared after he walked. Years of cultivation had long tempered his body. Purely walking without any spiritual power consumption, he should not be tired even if he walked for 3 days and 3 nights. There was indeed something strange here. He stopped and looked around attentively. However, except for a few feet of space, he could not see anything else. Darkness surrounded him, and everything seemed to be silent. Suddenly, there was a flash of light. It was the light on the Kunlun seal in his palm, which suddenly swayed. Lu Chen immediately felt it and looked down at the Kunlun seal. He saw that the golden seal, which was originally shining with golden light, was now as lustrous as before, but the light it emitted could not penetrate the surrounding darkness. And this golden light, which had been very stable all the way, suddenly shook at this moment. The light on the golden seal flickered, like a human's heartbeat, or like the breathing of a beast, constantly expanding and contracting. Suddenly, Lu Chen seemed to hear something. It was a movement that slowly came from the deepest part of the darkness. Hiss. The sound was not loud, and it was a little vague, making it unclear and unreal. He faintly felt that there was something rubbing against the hard ground and rocks. And not long after, the sound disappeared, as if it had never existed. Was it an illusion? Lu Chen raised his head. Suddenly, a chill blew from the front. It was a cold wind, and it also carried a trace of indescribable fishy smell. Hiss, the same vague sound appeared again, but this time it was clearer and closer. Lu Chen even lowered his head to look at the ground under his feet, because at that moment, when the sound sounded, he actually felt the ground under his feet was slightly trembling. That sound seemed to be slowly approaching him in the darkness. A cold, tyrannical, and indifferent aura slowly seeped out of the darkness, and the darkness began to faintly roll in front of Lu Chen's eyes. In the distance, nearby, the ground trembled, and an incomparably huge shadow slid and slid. The shadow hovered like a mountain, surrounding the unusually small human figure in the middle. Lu Chen did not speak, nor did he shout. He just gritted his teeth, silently raised the Kunlun seal in his hand, raised it to the highest point, and then opened his palm. Golden light emitted from the Kunlun seal, shining brightly and solemnly. The surrounding sound quieted down, and after a moment, suddenly a light lit up beside Lu Chen. It was a white and dazzling light, reflecting the huge, pale teeth. Yes, it was the head of an almost indescribable giant beast that suddenly appeared beside Lu Chen. Its mouth was even twice the size of Lu Chen's, and its sharp fangs were exposed, reflecting the Kunlun seal. Hiss. The strange sound echoed again, and the huge shadow in the darkness slowly straightened its body in front of Lu Chen. Chapter 537. The thick fog looked very calm from the outside. At most, only the fog on the surface was rolling slowly. As for the situation inside the fog, it was impossible to see at all. Therefore, when most people saw this fog, they would subconsciously feel that there was something strange in it, or that there were all kinds of mechanisms and traps that were hard to guess. However, they would never think that there was anything wrong with the fog itself. However, this thick fog itself was a very strange existence. Not long after Black Dog entered the thick fog, he understood this. At that time, he took a few steps at the edge of the fog and even poked his head out to greet Oxen triumphantly. Then, an accident happened. The fog around him seemed to have suddenly come to life, turning into something extremely terrifying and powerful. All of a sudden, it rushed in from all directions, grabbed Atsu's body, and then pulled Atsu into the depths of the thick fog. Caught off guard, Atsu was immediately grabbed, leaving only a hole in the shape of a dog's head at the edge of the fog outside. It was somewhat comical, and then it was quickly filled by other fog. After that, all that was left in front of Atsu's eyes was a blur. At the same time, countless terrifying and sharp whistling sounds rang out beside his ears, like the wailing of ghosts and the howling of wolves. There were also several cold auras that tightly hung onto his fur, twisting and twisting, wanting to drill into his body. It felt as if it had suddenly fallen into a nest of poisonous snakes, and there were suddenly tens of thousands of snakes around it. Of course, Atsu could not just sit and wait for death. Even if it could not, it was still roaring and struggling, desperately pulling. Needless to say, after the transformation, the big black dog's bloodline and strength were already at the top level of the holy beast of the southern border. Its strength was indeed different from the past. In addition to being caught off guard at the beginning, when Atsu began to struggle and resist, those strange things around it were not so easy to control it. Its muscles bulged, and its originally soft fur instantly became as tough as steel. Although the cold auras were powerful, they could not penetrate Atsu's body for a while. At the same time, Atsu roared and struggled madly. There was a series of deep pa-pa-pa-pa sounds, but it was as if something in the fog around it had snapped. But one strand of fog was broken, and at the same time, another 5 or 10 strands of fog rushed over. In this thick fog, there seemed to be an unimaginable number of strange things that could not be seen clearly, and they were rushing over from all directions like countless ropes, madly binding Atsu's body. Atsu was still struggling, but his voice carried a sorrowful tone. At the same time, he felt a trace of worry in his heart. It's such a terrifying mist, and Lu Chen had walked in as well. Could something have happened to him? Otherwise, why would there be no movement for so long? After the fierce struggle of Atsu, the inside of the thick fog had become a mess. All the fog was spinning and rolling rapidly, and countless screams could be heard one after another. Even though Atsu tried his best to resist, he was still caught and dragged into the depths of the fog. Moreover, it could be seen that even though Atsu's struggles temporarily blocked the harm to his body, as time passed, there would only be one end for him. A trace of despair and sadness flashed across Atsu's eyes. It was unknown whether it had thought at that moment that it was a dog that dominated the world, but now it died here so unjustly. It was too shameful. The fog rolled around, not caring about the sensitive dog at all. It was single-mindedly focused on grabbing this hard-won delicacy. After a long stalemate, just when Atsu was about to give up, a low cry suddenly came from the fog behind it. Moo! Oxen's huge body walked out of the fog. The strange thing was that the terrifying and arrogant fog, for some reason, was attacking the black dog crazily, but when it saw Oxen, it would all move aside. Occasionally, when there was fog that could not move away in time, Oxen would often just look at it, smack its lips, open its mouth, and spit out a ball of flame, burning the fog completely. Oxen's pace seemed slow, but it was actually very fast. In just a few steps, it had reached the side of Atsu, which was firmly bound by the thick fog. The fog that entangled its body did not move away, but still held on tightly to Atsu, as if it was reluctant to let go. Without any hesitation, Oxen opened its mouth and spat out a mouthful of golden flame. In an instant, there was a bone-chilling scream in the air, and the fog's tentacles were turned into nothingness. The black dog fell heavily to the ground with a plop. The thick fog shook violently, and those sharp cries went straight to the sky, as if there was something extremely angry roaring at Oxen. In response, Oxen's reaction was very arrogant, as if it could not even be bothered to respond. It only lowered its head to look at Atsu, then kicked Atsu's butt with its hoof. Atsu, which was a little dizzy from the fall, suddenly shivered and jumped up. When it saw Oxen standing beside it, its eyes instantly widened. Then, it looked at the strange thick fog around it, and Atsu's mouth opened wide. When it looked at Oxen again, its eyes were filled with awe. It looked just like when it first walked to the small mountain filled with spirit beasts on Kunlun Mountain and looked up at Oxen at the top of the mountain. This was not an ordinary Oxen, it was a god in the spirit beast world. Being stared at by this black dog with such a fervent and admiring gaze, even Oxen could not stand it. It let out a low moo, then turned around and prepared to leave. Atsu hurriedly followed. It stuck closely to Oxen's side and walked together with it. The fog around them surged, and screams were heard one after another, filled with anger and helplessness. However, just as this matter was about to end, suddenly, there was a sudden fluctuation in the thick fog in front of them. A moment later, a few screams were heard, followed by a series of intense fighting sounds. Then, the fog around Oxen suddenly paused, and like a gust of wind, it swept past them and rushed toward the place where the sounds came from. The scene was a little terrifying, as if a group of hungry sharks had smelled fresh blood and were madly rushing toward their prey. Atsu stopped and looked in that direction, then turned to look at Oxen. Oxen also stopped and looked in that direction. They were spirit beasts, so their ears were very sensitive. They clearly heard the sound earlier. It was a young girl's scream. At this moment, the only one who could make such a sound was White Lotus. She came in as well. Oxen raised its head and rolled its eyes, as if it wanted to leave, but when it looked down at the black dog, it realized that Atsu was standing there hesitantly. Oxen looked at Atsu, and Atsu felt its gaze. After a moment of hesitation, it wagged its tail and made a few deep sounds at Oxen. Oxen looked at Atsu quietly for a moment, then nodded and walked in the direction of the sound. Chapter 538. Oxen took a few steps forward and suddenly looked back, only to find that the black dog had also followed it and was right beside it. Oxen hesitated for a moment, but it shook its head and let out a low moo. It stopped and did not continue to move forward. Instead, it swung its tail and patted Atsu's head, then turned around and walked in the other direction. Atsu was a little stunned, but it still followed it. Just like that, it followed Oxen for a while and walked out of the thick fog. However, this place was, of course, not the top of the hill where it had just entered. Looking at the surroundings, it was somewhat similar to the place where White Lotus was standing just now. Oxen brought Atsu here. When it felt that it was safe, it barked at it twice, then turned around and walked back into the thick fog. Its meaning seemed very clear. It probably felt that it should bring Atsu out first. After staying in the thick fog for a long time, it was always dangerous. Even if it wanted to save two people at the same time, it would be a little difficult. Atsu seemed to understand what Oxen meant, so after the initial surprise, it quickly calmed down. However, it still looked at the thick fog anxiously. After Oxen turned around and entered again, the fog seemed to have calmed down again, at least from the outside. What kind of strange thing was hidden in this thick fog? It was so strange and terrifying, and it was in the depths of the 1,000-year-old Kunlun party. It was really hard to imagine. It was also very puzzling. Why did the Kunlun party allow this thing to exist here for so many years? Atsu waited for a while, but there was still no sign of Oxen coming out. This made it a little anxious, but it did not dare to enter the thick fog again. In the end, it simply lay down on the ground. In its heart, it thought of Lu Chen who had entered this mysterious forbidden area earlier. It wondered how he was doing now. Lu Chen didn't feel good. While Atsu was worried that Lu Chen would be hurt by the fog, Lu Chen had actually passed through the dangerous fog with the help of the Kunlun seal and arrived at the deepest part of the earth, which was the biggest secret hiding place in Kunlun Mountain. However, this place seemed to be the deepest darkness in the world, and even light couldn't penetrate it. In his mind's imagination, especially after passing through the ancient and huge door in front of him, he felt that he should be in an unprecedentedly huge underground cave, even bigger than the cave he saw in the mysterious city below the Celestial City. But all of this was just his conjecture. In fact, he knew nothing more than 3 feet around him. The darkness here was so thick that it blocked almost all of his senses. At the same time, there was another mysterious force that constantly interfered with his perception. Rationally, he kept telling himself that this should be a huge space, but in reality, Lu Chen always felt that there seemed to be an extra wall around him, a dark and high wall. Many times, he would hit a hard wall if he took a step, and maybe the next step would be a dead end. Until an indescribable giant beast suddenly appeared in the darkness. In Lu Chen's mind, the invisible high walls around him seemed to have suddenly turned into a huge mountain, tightly sandwiching him in the middle. He stopped in his tracks and subconsciously tightened his body. There was nothing he could do. Even though he had always had a strong will, the huge mouth and fangs that were right in front of him, as well as the unimaginably huge body in the darkness, made him feel insignificant. It was an instinctive reaction. However, this unknown giant beast that suddenly appeared from the darkness did not seem to be like those bloodthirsty beasts that directly crushed the little ant in front of it with the force of a thunderbolt. Instead, it remained motionless after it appeared. After a moment of calmness, Lu Chen immediately raised his arm. He raised one arm towards the sky and slowly raised it up high. In his palm was the Kunlun seal that was flickering with golden light. As he slowly raised it up high, it lit up and seemed to brighten up the surroundings. In the surrounding darkness, there seemed to be a flash of lightning. A moment later, a light suddenly emerged from the darkness, and then gradually became clear. It was a huge eye, right above the huge mouth. It seemed that since the beginning, this giant beast had only placed its head next to Lu Chen, but did not open its eyes. The eye was very big, but the pupil was strangely long and thin. The surroundings were golden, but the pupil was unfathomably dark, like the pupil of a snake. Lu Chen raised the Kunlun seal to the highest point he could reach. Other than that, he remained silent and did not speak. The strange and huge eye set its eyes on the Kunlun seal. The golden light was reflected in its pupil, like a burning flame. Then, like a thunder from the depths of the sky, a voice with a soul-shaking power echoed in Lu Chen's ears, saying, "Who are you to Tianlan?" Lu Chen frowned, only feeling a faint buzzing sound in his ears. He hurriedly ran his spiritual force, and after a while, this discomfort was suppressed. Then he said in a clear voice, "My name is Lu Chen, a disciple of perfected Lord Tianlan." There seemed to be a trace of surprise in the huge eye. It looked at Lu Chen with some strange and complicated emotions, and said, "Doesn't he never accept disciples?" Lu Chen said, "Earlier this year, he accepted me on Sky Dragon Mountain in the Immortal City." Hiss. A strange sound came from around, as if the body of the huge beast was slowly moving. At the same time, there seemed to be a slightly mocking laugh in the darkness, and then the huge beast said in a low voice, "It seems that even he can't stand to be alone for the rest of his life." Speaking of this, the huge beast paused, then looked at Lu Chen and said, "What's your name?" "Lu Chen." The huge beast shook its head slowly and said, "Not this. It's the Taoist name he gave you." Lu Chen was stunned for a moment. He did not expect that the gigantic beast in front of him would know about the inheritance of the Tian Daoist name like the back of his hand. It was obvious that perfected Lord Tianlan had an unimaginably close relationship with this ancient beast that had been hiding in the depths of Kunlun Mountain for countless years. After hesitating for a moment, Lu Chen decided to tell the truth. "Tianing. Tianing." Ah. The huge beast seemed to think about this Taoist name for a while, then suddenly laughed in a low voice, but Lu Chen could not tell whether it was sarcasm or praise in its laughter. After a while, the huge beast said lightly, "For many years, those who inherited this Taoist name, Tian, did not have a good ending. Don't regret it." Lu Chen's body trembled slightly. He looked up at the strange huge eye high up in the sky and suddenly asked, "My master and I are still alive, and I'm not familiar with the past of my ancestors. However, I've heard that my grandmaster, ancestor Tian Hong, died of old age and passed away safely under the care of his two personal disciples." In the darkness, the huge beast looked at him. After a while, it said coldly, "Do you believe Tianlan's words?" Chapter 539. Did you believe Tianlan's words? After so many years, did you still believe that damn Baldy? From that little boy to the shadow that blended into the darkness, from a wandering street to a cold-blooded killer, how many years have passed together? Now let me ask you, is he still trustworthy? Is he really trustworthy? Lu Chen stared at the strange huge eye in the air, his face expressionless and unusually calm. After a while, he said, "I believe you." "Ha, ha, ha." The giant beast in the dark sneered. Its huge body hidden in the shadows seemed to move again, oppressing the earth and making it tremble slightly. It seemed that it might collapse like a hill at any time and crush Lu Chen, who was trapped in the center, into pieces. However, the hill did not collapse. Except for a few sneers, the giant beast did not do anything else and just remained silent to Lu Chen. After a while, it said coldly, "Why didn't Tianlan come to see me himself?" Obviously, Lu Chen had had a very in-depth conversation with Supreme Tianlan before he came here, so he did not hesitate to answer the question of the giant dark beast. He answered directly, "He can't leave." Now the situation in the Immortal City seems calm, but in fact, undercurrents are surging. We can't afford to be careless. My master must stay in the Immortal City and can't leave. The giant beast snorted, obviously disapproving of this reason. In fact, in the eyes of this level of giant beast, the power struggles that human beings valued were only ridiculous. But other than that, it did not have any other reaction. It just asked again, "Then what are you doing here?" Lu Chen took a deep breath and tightened the Kunlun seal on his palm. Then he said, my master asked me to tell you that it's time. In the dark world, because of the light of the Kunlun seal, the strange eye of the giant beast, and the conversation between Lu Chen and the giant beast, this originally cold and lonely world had some business. However, after Lu Chen said those words, everything around him seemed to have suddenly changed. The light was still the same, and the figure was still the same, but the atmosphere had completely changed. All sounds disappeared at that moment, and the dark world seemed to have fallen into a dead silence. After a moment, the huge snake-like eye also disappeared. Then there was the sound of thunder, suddenly drifting from the darkness, from far to near, rumbling. Then, the darkness suddenly rolled, and a tall figure like a huge mountain appeared in front of Lu Chen. It was almost impossible to see the whole figure, but the golden light of the Kunlun seal seemed to have been unlocked at this moment. Suddenly, the light shone brightly and shot toward the surroundings, illuminating the dark world. Lu Chen held his breath and stared ahead. At the border between the brilliant golden radiance and the endless darkness, a huge shadow descended. In the depths of his pupils, that shocking scene was reflected. An indescribably huge black dragon slowly appeared in front of him. The dragon's breath was like a thunderclap, and the huge dragon's claws pressed on the ground, causing the rocks to crack. This kind of terrible and terrifying creature should never exist in this world, because they always seem to have the power to easily destroy the world. Its body seemed to have an ancient and wild aura, as if it had come from ancient times and suddenly appeared in this world. The dragon race, which once only existed in myths and legends, appeared in front of Lu Chen for the first time. The time has come. The rumbling sound was like rolling thunder, slowly rolling over the top of Lu Chen's head, and the huge dragon's head fell down. This time, it was a pair of dragon eyes that lit up, and Lu Chen could even see the surprise and disappointment in those eyes. Perhaps it had been waiting for this day for far too long. Lu Chen clenched the Kunlun seal in his hand, nodded, and then said, "Yes, the time has come. Master asked me to tell you, and then said that if you are willing, you can come with me to the immortal city." In the forbidden area between the clouds in the sky, oxen walked in the thick fog, and it did not seem to be in a hurry at all. Although it had taken some time to bring Atsu out of the thick fog, it did not seem to care. Even if there was another girl waiting for its rescue in the thick fog, oxen seemed to be full of confidence. It was as if this bull would always be so unhurried. It walked confidently, and along the way, the fog avoided it, and it did not encounter any resistance or obstacles along the way. Of course, there was no danger to speak of. The fog that was so dense that it could make people lose their sense of direction did not seem to have any effect on the green ox. At most, it raised its head and probed the air a few times. Then, it quickly determined the direction and walked in that direction. Not long after, it heard the sounds of an intense struggle. At this time, it was impossible for anyone else to be struggling in the fog except for White Lotus. Oxen walked in that direction, and in a few steps, it saw the figure of White Lotus in the depths of the fog, who was trying her best to resist the monsters in the surrounding fog. A gust of cold air blew in its face, and Oxen stopped in its tracks. It was the cold air that was emitted from White Lotus's body, and all the fog that was pouncing on her was somewhat afraid of this kind of cold air, and for a moment, it could do nothing to her. However, White Lotus was also flustered, and it was obvious that her breathing was not calm, and her follow-up was weak. It seemed that after a while, she would be exhausted and defeated. Oxen walked straight over. Suddenly, there was a loud howl in the thick fog, and it seemed to be extremely angry, and it roared at Oxen crazily. However, Oxen ignored it and only walked all the way to White Lotus's side. On the way, there were a few clouds of fog that seemed to be unable to bear it and blocked its way. Oxen directly spat a few mouthfuls of flames at them, burning them completely. White Lotus also saw the figure of Oxen, and especially when she saw Oxen's actions, a look of shock and awe flashed across her eyes. She had never seen such a powerful giant beast before. Oxen walked to her side, and the surrounding fog that had been attacking endlessly retreated angrily but helplessly, giving way to an empty space. White Lotus finally breathed a sigh of relief, and her body suddenly became weak, and she almost sat on the ground. Oxen glanced at her, and then signaled White Lotus to get on its back. White Lotus was startled for a moment, and she was a little hesitant. After all, she was not familiar with this oxen, but now that it was a matter of life and death, there was no room for hesitation, so she quickly climbed up. Then, Oxen turned around and left. The surrounding fog chased after it, but it did not dare to get close, and from time to time, there were shrill and angry cries, looking flustered and exasperated. On the back of the ox, White Lotus breathed a sigh of relief, and at the same time, a complicated expression flashed across her face. The giant beast under her was the most powerful creature she had ever seen in her life, and it was far stronger than the low-level magical beasts and monsters that she had encountered when she was cultivating the blood food's secret technique. She seemed to be a little uneasy. She thought of her fate of wandering around all these years. Suddenly, something moved on her neck. She looked down and found that it was a twig that she wore on her body. She did not know how it had fallen out during the fierce battle just now, and now it was hanging in front of her chest. She stared at this ancient branch and did not speak for a long time. Chapter 540. The black dog felt that the night was exceptionally long, and time was passing extremely slowly. Whether it was Lu Chen or that oxen, neither of them responded to the thick fog after entering it. They did not return for a long time. There were several times when it could not help but stand up and walk to the edge of the thick fog, wanting to go in and search again. However, every time it recalled its embarrassing appearance in the thick fog, it could not help but shrink back. If it was not for Oxen's rescue, Atsu would probably have been trapped in the thick fog and could not extricate itself. However, when Atsu recalled the encounter just now, it felt a little annoyed and unwilling. Because when Atsu was in the thick fog, it could feel that its strength was actually not weaker than those strange creatures hidden in the fog. However, the reason why it was in such a predicament was that it could not fight back at all. First, there were too many of them hiding in the fog, and it was almost impossible to defend against them. Second, it was as if all its struggles were hitting the air, and it could not exert any strength at all. Thinking of this, Atsu was also annoyed, but it still took 2 steps back subconsciously. This fog was really a bit strange. If only it could directly spit fire like oxen and burn those strange creatures to death, Atsu was suddenly startled. It stood still and looked back at the fog, seemingly a little lost in thought. After a while, it slowly walked back to the edge of the fog. It seemed to be a little hesitant, but in the end, it quickly made up its mind. Its broad and strong body stood straight, and then a trace of darkness suddenly flashed across its eyes. It looked like a ball of black fireworks. "I've been waiting for this day for a long, long time," a thunderous voice echoed in this dark underground world. In Lu Chen's eyes, the unimaginably huge black dragon, the terrifying creature that should not exist in this world, seemed to have fallen into a memory at this moment, recalling the things that happened many, many years ago. Most of its huge body was hidden in the darkness, but just the part that was revealed was enough to strike fear into people's hearts. It was like a towering mountain. Lu Chen even subconsciously thought of all the things he had experienced in his life. Due to various reasons, he was far more experienced and knowledgeable than ordinary people, including some strange creatures that most people in this world had never seen or heard of. For example, the Great Snowy Mountain, the legendary Heavenly Wolf, and all kinds of strange monsters hidden in the abyss, all of them gave people a soul-stirring feeling. However, those creatures seemed rather normal compared to the black dragon in front of them. No matter how one looked at it, this black dragon was a legendary monster that belonged to the imagination of humans. It should never have existed in this world. However, at this moment, Lu Chen was facing it so seriously. Then, he heard the dragon reply, "I'm going to the Celestial City." This reply was clear and could not possibly have any other meaning. In fact, this reply completely matched the prediction that perfected Lord Tianlan had made before Lu Chen set off. Lu Chen clearly remembered that he had asked perfected Lord Tianlan what to do if the black dragon did not agree to come. Perfected Lord Tianlan had smiled and said very calmly, "If it's not willing to come, then let it be. However, it will definitely come." Reality once again proved that perfected Lord Tianlan's judgment was correct. Sometimes, Lu Chen would wonder if this damn Baldy had ever made a wrong decision on an important matter after so many years. If he had to make an enemy of someone who almost always made the right decision, how terrifying would that be? Now that things had come to this, although Lu Chen did not know why the Black Dragon wanted to go to the Celestial City, nor did he understand what perfected Lord Tianlan meant by telling him that, the time has come, the most important thing for him right now was not to think about these useless things. He had to prepare to bring the Black Dragon to the Celestial City. If such a huge dragon were to head to the Celestial City just like that, the commotion could be said to be earth-shattering. However, it seemed that neither the Black Dragon nor perfected Lord Tianlan, who was far away in the Celestial City, had any intention of doing so. Lu Chen had already been briefed, so he very quickly threw the Kunlun seal in his hand into the air. The shining golden seal flipped in the air and flew to the front of the huge dragon. Then, it suddenly stopped, as if it had been grabbed by a force. The Black Dragon leaned forward as if it was about to make a move. However, at that moment, its eyes suddenly narrowed and it raised its head. It seemed to be slightly surprised. After a while, the huge dragon's head slowly descended and stopped in front of Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked at the sharp fangs not too far away from him and frowned slightly. He took a step back and then asked, "What's wrong?" The Black Dragon stared at him. After a while, it suddenly said, "I smell the aura of the black fire." Black fire? Lu Chen was stunned. Then, he was shocked and his expression changed slightly. The Black Dragon did not continue to speak to him. Instead, it stared at him. After a moment, suddenly, in the dragon's eyes, in that strange, slender snake pupil, a ball of black flames suddenly shot out. Yes, it was a ball of black fire. No one, at least in the world that Lu Chen knew of, no one knew the source of the black fire. Even Lu Chen himself, who possessed this strange power, was still in a very unfamiliar state with the black fire. He did not know the origin of the black fire, did not understand its origin, and did not know what the black fire would become in the future. He only used an almost instinctive ability to control the black fire. This ancient and strange power had saved him many times. Now, it had almost become his greatest and final trump card. However, this black fire power did not belong to him alone. As far as he knew, there were at least 3 other black fire powers in this world. One was the Dead Fire Shaman, the second was the Black Fire Tribe in the distant southern wilderness, and the last was the Black Dog that followed him. What was funny was that other than the Dead Fire Shaman and the Black Fire Tribe, Lu Chen and Atu's black fire energy had come from an unknown and strange place, so much so that they couldn't explain it. Until today, when Lu Chen suddenly sensed the power of the 4th black fire in this world. Moreover, the power of the black fire was so strong, pure, and clean. It was as if the black fire had just been born. It naturally carried an ancient and wild aura, just like the Black Dragon. Then, as if it was summoned by the primitive but powerful black fire power, Lu Chen suddenly found that the black fire in his body seemed to have gone out of control. It suddenly rose up, and when he was caught off guard, his eyes also burned with a raging black fire. At that moment, Lu Chen suddenly thought of the experience when the black fire in his body was suddenly awakened on the mountain of Kunlun a long time ago. That feeling was almost the same as now. The Black Dragon looked at him condescendingly, its eyes seemed to be very complicated. After a while, he heard the Black Dragon slowly say, "Why does the disciple of Tianlan not have his divine sense, but the power of our dragon tribe?" Chapter 541. The Power of the Dragon Clan? When Lu Chen heard the Black Dragon's words, his first reaction was to wonder if he had misheard. Ever since he first came into contact with the power of the Black Fire in the Barren Valley over 10 years ago, he still wasn't very clear about the origin and history of the Black Fire. However, he at least knew that the Black Fire had never had anything to do with the legendary Dragon Clan in the past 10 years. If he really had to say that it was related to the legend, then when he wandered into the southern wilderness and stayed with the barbarians, the ancient legend of the Black Fire tribe was that the black fire originated from the fire god was the only exception. However, the fire god that the Black Fire tribe worshipped was clearly not the same as the huge black dragon in front of him. At the very least, in the many years that Lu Chen lived in the Black Fire tribe, he had never seen a statue or totem in the shape of a dragon. This was impossible for a tribe that had always had a firm belief in the southern wilderness. However, the Black Fire tribe's current attitude was clearly very confident in this matter. His tone was as if it was only natural and without any hesitation. This caused Lu Chen to hesitate. After all, no matter how he looked at it, the black dragon didn't seem to have any reason to lie to him. Then, Lu Chen suddenly frowned as he thought of something. Apart from the first 10 years when he was tormented to the point where he wished he was dead, Lu Chen discovered that the power of the black fire was extremely strange after he subdued it. It was different from any Dao or magical power that he knew of in the world. This was because it didn't seem to need to cultivate. Most of the time, the black fire would peacefully hide in Lu Chen's body without a trace. Even true Lord Tianlan, who had the ability to see through the heavens and earth, would find it difficult to detect the strangeness in Lu Chen's body. However, when Lu Chen was in danger, he could quickly activate this power and use it to suppress his enemies. Lu Chen had tried many methods, including many cultivation methods from the human cultivation world, to test the black fire, but it was useless. Later on, Lu Chen found the only way to make the black fire grow: killing and death. Every time he killed someone or killed another living being, his body would automatically absorb a strange power. Most of the time, it was very weak, but it was definitely there. It would slowly nourish the black fire, allowing it to grow. It made one's hair stand on end. Even Lu Chen himself felt very uncomfortable. Even though he felt like he was some kind of monster that sucked blood to live, he still felt like he was a blood-sucking monster. But the truth was that the black fire was not a righteous power. It had always leaned towards the darkness. During this process, although the surrounding fog seemed to be abnormally active, hissing and moving, until the end, there was still not a trace of fog that broke through the invisible boundary. Obviously, the person who set up various restrictive means here was an extremely powerful ancestor of the Kunlun party in the previous generation. Then, Lu Chen saw Atsu. Atsu looked safe and sound as it squatted a few feet away from the thick fog. Beside it stood Oxen and another beautiful girl. It was White Lotus. Seeing White Lotus and Oxen also standing here, Lu Chen could not help but be startled, but he did not take it to heart. He glanced at White Lotus, then smiled and walked towards Atsu. He first reached out and touched the head of Atsu, who stood up happily and wagged its tail at him. Then, he walked over and patted Oxen's head, saying with a smile, "Hello, old friend." Oxen glanced at him and let out a moo. Then, Lu Chen turned around and said to Atsu, "Things are done, Atsu, let's go back to the Immortal City." Atsu barked twice, nodded and wagged its tail without any objection, but at this moment, Lu Chen suddenly felt his sleeve tighten. He looked down and saw that Oxen had walked to his side and bit his sleeve. "What's wrong?" Lu Chen asked it. Oxen barked, then pointed to the north. Lu Chen thought carefully, and his expression changed slightly. With a hint of doubt, he asked, "You also want to go to the Immortal City with us?" Oxen nodded. Lu Chen was stunned. This oxen's identity and origin were extraordinary. It was a spiritual beast that Supreme Lord Tianlan had raised for many years, and its cultivation was unfathomable. In the entire Kunlun mountain range, it was second to none. Did it want to go to the Immortal City to see its master, Supreme Lord Tianlan? But when Supreme Lord Tianlan told him to come over, he did not say anything about this oxen. Should he take it with him? Lu Chen hesitated for a moment, but he did not notice that White Lotus, who had been standing at the side without saying a word, was still looking at this oxen from time to time, and there was a glimmer in the depths of her eyes. Chapter 542. Although Oxen's sudden request was somewhat abrupt and surprising, Lu Chen did not dwell on it for too long. Anyway, this bull was Supreme Tianlan's pet. Although he did not know why every time Tianlan left Kunlun Mountain for the Immortal City, he did not bring oxen with him and left it in Kunlun Mountain. But when the time came, as long as he said that oxen had followed him, Supreme Tianlan would not say anything. Lu Chen had known this oxen for a long time. He had seen it when he was young, so he felt some affection for it. So he finally nodded, patted oxen, and agreed. Oxen mooed and seemed to be in a good mood. Atsu also seemed to be very happy. Then, Lu Chen looked at White Lotus, who was standing at the side. He wanted to say something but stopped. After a moment of silence, he turned back to Oxen and Atsu and said, "Let's go back to the Immortal City." He emphasized some words in this sentence and then walked forward. From beginning to end, he did not speak to White Lotus, as if he was somewhat ignoring this young girl. Atsu wagged its tail and followed. Before Oxen took a step, it suddenly glanced at the mountain in the distance where Winter Peak had once crashed. But it did not have any further reaction and followed behind Lu Chen. One man and two beasts walked for a while. Lu Chen heard footsteps coming from behind. He sighed in his heart and then stopped to look back. White Lotus caught up from behind and walked to his side without saying a word. She stared at him with a calm expression. Lu Chen frowned and said, "You also want to go back to the Immortal City with me?" "Yes." White Lotus nodded. Although she did not say much, her expression was calm, as if what she said was a matter of course. Her tone was very firm. Lu Chen looked at her, and after a while, he said, "Why bother? It's been so hard for you to get the chance to come out." White Lotus said, "I have nowhere else to go." Lu Chen shook his head and said, "No matter how big the world is, there will always be a place for you." White Lotus snorted and said, "The world is so big. If I offend that person, there will be no place for me to stand." Lu Chen stared into her eyes and said after a while, "That's not right." White Lotus sneered, "Of course you don't care, you're not me. You're high and mighty with power in your hands, and you're in high spirits. How would you understand my situation?" She seemed to be a little angry. She clenched her teeth and said, "You can't go home. You can't sleep at night. You can't even tell if you'll live or die tomorrow. Do you understand?" "I understand," Lu Chen said. There was a sudden silence between the two. Oxen and Black Dog, who were standing to the side, seemed to have noticed something and looked in their direction. White Lotus stared at Lu Chen, her chest rising and falling slightly. Her expression was one of surprise and anger. Lu Chen, however, didn't seem to care about her expression. He only said calmly, "The world is so big. How can there be no place for me to stand?" White Lotus's expression darkened. She snorted and said, "I'm not like you, a loner. I have a big family behind me. If I can run, can they run too?" Lu Chen wasn't moved by this deep and warm family bond at all. He didn't even show the slightest change in his expression. He said, "I don't believe it. If losing the Bai family could help you get rid of that damn Baldy, you wouldn't even blink. Don't talk to me about this." White Lotus was so angry that she almost jumped up. She pointed at Lu Chen and scolded, "Do you think everyone is as cold-blooded as you?" Lu Chen said, "Of course not. You're the only one who is like me." White Lotus was speechless. She rolled her eyes and the anger on her face disappeared. Just as she was thinking about what to say, she saw that Lu Chen had turned around and continued to walk forward. White Lotus frowned and caught up with him. She said, "What do you mean by this?" Lu Chen didn't look at her. He just looked at the towering dark mountains in the distance and said lightly, "You're not anyone to me. I just said a few words casually. Whether you return to the Immortal City or not, it has nothing to do with me." White Lotus was silent. In the deep night, they still walked together, even if they each had their own thoughts. There were some words that they didn't say out loud. Perhaps they didn't need to say much. They were all smart people and understood in their hearts. How could there be so many excuses? How could there be so many reasons? The reason why they didn't want to take risks and return to the most prosperous and noisy giant city in the world was because they were unwilling to give up. They were reluctant to give up their talents and the expectations they had since they were young. Since they had tasted the taste of the infinitely beautiful scenery at the peak, how could they be willing to return to mediocrity for the rest of their lives? It was said that if you take a step back, the sea and the sky would be wide open. But under the vast sea and sky, you, after all, are just a tiny ant. When they walked further and further in the night and were about to disappear into the night, a figure suddenly emerged from the darkness on the earthen mountain at the edge of the forbidden area. With the help of the glimmer of light, it could be seen that this was the acting head of the Kunlun party, Immortal Qian Dang. There was no one beside him. He stood alone on the top of the earthen mountain. After his appearance, the strange thick fog seemed to be stirred. It suddenly rolled, like a pack of hungry wolves showing their ferocious faces to the food not far away. However, the invisible boundary still firmly blocked them. In the end, the fog could not cross the boundary. Immortal Qian Dang didn't seem to care about the fog. He frowned slightly and looked at Lu Chen and the others who had entered the most important forbidden area of the Kunlun party. For some reason, he didn't make it difficult for them to stay. Very soon, the figures of Lu Chen and the others finally disappeared into the night. Immortal Qian Dang shook his head. The expression on his face was complicated. He seemed to be full of thoughts. He turned around and looked at the extremely thick fog. A strange light flashed in the depths of his eyes. How many more secrets were hidden in the majestic Kunlun under the 1,000-year-old sect? On the same night, tens of thousands of miles away on the Four Rivers Plain, the magnificent immortal city was still bustling and noisy. Even in the dead of night, it was still brightly lit. In the Kunlun Hall on Mount Celestial Dragon, True Lord Tianlan, who was sitting cross-legged on a lotus throne, suddenly felt uneasy. He was unexpectedly a bit agitated. As if he sensed something, he calmed down and pondered for a moment. Then, he got down from the lotus throne and floated to the ground. Then, he slowly walked out of the Kunlun Hall. It was quiet all around. The night was dark. He stood in front of the grand hall and looked up at the sky. He didn't know when it started, but a red light suddenly appeared and crossed the sky. Then, the red light was like a tide, covering the sky and the sun. It filled half of the sky, and just like a few days ago, it divided the entire sky into two halves. No, it was not two complete halves. On the ground, the burly bald man in a loose robe quietly looked at the night sky. He watched as the originally straight red line slowly surged forward like the waves of the sea. Wave after wave, it rushed through the center line and covered more of the night sky. It only stopped when it covered about 10% of the sky. The blood-red sky once again appeared in the human world. It was reflected in his eyes like a strange painting. One could also faintly see that the corners of his mouth were slightly raised, revealing a trace of a strange smile. Chapter 543. Lu Chen and his group left Kunlun Mountain under the cover of the night. They did not delay on their journey as they moved forward in the direction of the Immortal City. However, the Immortal City was still thousands of miles away from the Western Land. Although they were all cultivators, it would still take them a long time to get there. As a famous mountain sect, Kunlun Mountain was inextricably linked to Lu Chen and White Lotus. However, for some reason, the two of them did not seem to have any nostalgia for this place. They left without hesitation and even seemed to be eager to leave this place as soon as possible. They did not want to see this mountain again. About 3 days later, they finally left Kunlun Mountain behind. Even when they occasionally looked back, they could not see the mountain most of the time. Along the way, Atsu and oxen followed them. Atsu was very interested in oxen and often followed oxen to communicate with it. Although they did not understand what Atsu barked meant, oxen did not seem to hate this black dog. At most, it was too lazy to pay attention to it. In addition, Atsu would usually run to Lu Chen to get close to him for a while. Except for White Lotus, Atsu seemed to have always been very wary of White Lotus and would not easily get close to her. Of course, White Lotus also felt that Atsu was alienating them, but she did not care. During this period of time, the girls seemed to be a lot quieter. In fact, most of the time, she would often peek at oxen from the side. On this day, they had walked for another day. In addition to the previous few days of rushing, both humans and beasts were a little tired. Lu Chen decided to rest tonight. Finally, he looked around and found a small forest by the side of the road to rest. The forest was not too big, but it was dense enough to shelter them from the wind. If there was no one to guide them, it was difficult to find people in the forest from the outside. On the contrary, people hiding in the forest could see the situation outside the forest more clearly. It could be regarded as a good place, hidden and safe. Lu Chen and White Lotus looked around and were very satisfied. As for Atsu and Oxen, Lu Chen decided not to ask for their opinions. In the end, everyone settled down in this forest and prepared to rest for the night before continuing their journey the next morning. When night fell, everyone had already settled down in the forest, roughly forming a triangle. Oxen was in one corner, White Lotus was in another corner, and Atsu was lying together with Lu Chen in the last corner. It was strange. Although Atsu and Oxen were almost glued together during the day, when it was time to sleep, Atsu would definitely run back to Lu Chen and stay by his side. Even if it was in a daze, it would still stay with Lu Chen. Perhaps, this was also a kind of attachment. Lu Chen wasn't sure why Atsu was so dependent on him. However, they had been together for so many years, and they already had feelings for each other. Therefore, Lu Chen just let it be. In the dead of night, everyone fell asleep. Lu Chen and White Lotus were sleeping with their clothes on, Oxen was sleeping with its huge head on the ground, and Atsu was sleeping next to Lu Chen, using one of Lu Chen's thighs as a pillow. However, in this quiet moment, Atsu's ears suddenly moved, and then it suddenly opened its eyes. There was a faint green glow in its eyes, and the drowsiness it had before was suddenly gone, replaced by vigilance and hostility. It turned its head and looked around. In the dark forest, there seemed to be only the cold wind blowing from the treetops. Atsu stretched out its front foot and gently pushed Lu Chen's face. When Lu Chen opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Atsu's eyes, which had a strange luster to them. Atsu was also looking at it, and its paw was still on Lu Chen's cheek. One person and one dog quietly looked at each other. After a while, the light in Lu Chen's eyes gradually brightened, and the little bit of sleepiness disappeared. After a while, he slowly nodded to Atsu. Atsu retracted its paw. Lu Chen raised his eyes and looked at the night sky. The night was dark, and the treetops and branches seemed to be covered in darkness. There was only the rustling sound of the wind, and the swaying branches seemed to be slightly more violent than before. Lu Chen frowned, turned over and sat up. When he looked to his left and right, he found that both White Lotus and Oxen were still sleeping at the moment, and they seemed to have not noticed any sound at all. Atsu turned its head and looked in a certain direction in the night, and Lu Chen immediately looked in that direction. It seemed to be the deepest part of the darkness, without a trace of light, but in Lu Chen's view, no matter what, it could not compare to the darkness in the underground world in the forbidden area of Kunlun. Because only the territory of the Black Dragon was the real darkness in the world, and even light could be swallowed. After leaving the Kunlun mountain, the Black Dragon entered the Kunlun seal and did not make any sound, as if it had disappeared. Along the way, Lu Chen secretly took out the golden seal to check, but just as he did on the way here, the Kunlun seal did not respond to his various tests. It seemed that only when it reached the Kunlun mountain, the Kunlun seal would change, especially in the sky, where the Kunlun seal could be said to have reached the peak of its power. At any other time, the Kunlun seal would be the same as now, half dead and unresponsive, and Lu Chen could not find where the huge black dragon was hiding at the moment. However, the more it was like this, the more interested Lu Chen was in the Kunlun seal. He also clearly knew that what he saw was not a trick, because in his body, there was another treasure buried deep in his heart, that strange seed, which also had a similar strange ability. But in between, he clearly knew that there was a world of difference between the two. In the seed was the ancient and mysterious tree hole, the size was less than the size of a common house, but if the black dragon could not change and shrink its body, then the strange space sealed in the Kunlun seal would be frighteningly big. Could there be such a shocking treasure in this world? As if in response to the thought in Lu Chen's mind, when he stood up, a ray of light suddenly lit up in the dark corner. Sword light. It pierced out from the depths of the darkness, and in an instant, the light shone brightly, and the sword turned into 10 swords, 100 swords, 1,000 swords, 10,000 swords. The wind howled, and in an instant, a row of more than 10 trees were blown down, forming a raging tide of sword light like a huge wave, sweeping towards Lu Chen. Amidst the sword glint in the wind, amidst the mournful whistling, a pair of ice-cold eyes locked onto Lu Chen's body. Then, a voice came along with the wind, and it was as cold as the edge of a sword. Hand over the token of the sect leader. The next moment, the sword light directly drowned the land where Lu Chen was standing. Chapter 544. Sect Leader's Token. Before he was engulfed by the sword light, Lu Chen heard these 4 words. Even though his body reacted in an instant, the spiritual power went berserk, the black fire rose to resist this sudden attack, but Lu Chen's mind still involuntarily went blank and sluggish for a moment. In that instant, he immediately and nimbly went through his entire body once, every item, every magical weapon, including his biggest secret seed. He felt that none of them could be linked to the sect leader's token. And he did not even know what the sect leader's token that the assailant mentioned was. One must know, this kind of thing may be a rare treasure, it may be a rare treasure, but it could also be some kind of inconspicuous thing passed down by the ancient ancestors. It was not worth much, but because it was sentimental, everyone valued it, and it became a treasured heavy weapon. But there was no such thing. The sword light was sharp and powerful, the person's cultivation was very high, and his attack was fierce. If Lu Chen did not judge the pressure he was under at this moment, this masked person who suddenly appeared in the dark could even be a Jinren whose cultivation was in the realm of Yuanying. The Yuanying Jinren who could walk unhindered in the divine continent's cultivation world, turned into an assassin and launched a sneak attack. This possibility, even for Lu Chen, could not help but feel a chill in his heart. That sword, the sword light was like a mountain, the sword's shadow was like the sea, rolling over like a raging wave. The force of the sword was like thunder. Before it reached the front, there was already a sharp airflow rushing over, directly piercing his heart, causing his heart to feel so vexed that he almost vomited blood. Or perhaps he was really about to die in the dark night. At that critical moment, the black fire instantly burned in Lu Chen's eyes. Under his clothes, his originally smooth and complete flesh suddenly twisted, like the flat ground suddenly cracking, and then like magma black fire spewed out. He instantly turned into a black burning man. The black fire roared and roared, it was the only light that refused to yield in the sky full of sword light. In that extremely short moment, it was only a blink of an eye, the sword light had already collided. Boom! With a loud bang, Lu Chen's entire body was sent flying, and the sword radiance that filled the sky also retreated. After a moment, it slowly disappeared, and in the embers of the radiance, a man in black clothes and a black mask slowly appeared. The man's body swayed slightly, and a hint of surprise flashed through his eyes, as if he was surprised by the result just now. He did not immediately chase after Lu Chen. Instead, he stayed where he was for a while and steadied his body. It seemed that the attack just now had actually caused his qi and blood to surge, and he had suffered a slight backlash. But in comparison, on the other side, Lu Chen's situation was much worse. He was originally caught off guard by the sneak attack, but the opponent's skills were shockingly high, and his attacks were fierce and decisive. Lu Chen was at a disadvantage in almost every aspect. After doing his utmost to block this extremely powerful attack, Lu Chen flew backwards into the forest, breaking 3 or 4 trees in succession before falling to the ground. While he was still flying through the air, Lu Chen had already spat out a mouthful of blood. But when he landed in the forest, the raging black fire on his body had already shrunk back into his body. Under the dusky shade of the trees, he was like a ghost. After falling heavily to the ground, he almost did not have the slightest hesitation. His body suddenly twisted and turned. After rolling to the side in the darkness, he immediately blended into the surrounding shadows, and actually disappeared. After a moment, the sword light whistled mournfully again. The masked assassin had already reached the place where Lu Chen had landed. However, there was only a mess left on the ground. Crushed grass and trees, broken branches, and a pool of dark red blood stained the ground. But Lu Chen was nowhere to be seen. That Lu Chen, who was obviously injured by the sneak attack, actually disappeared in a blink of an eye, hiding somewhere unknown. In the masked man's eyes, his pupils suddenly contracted, his eyes revealed surprise and anger. Obviously he did not expect Lu Chen to have such a strange method. He looked like a ghost. No, that method of hiding and escaping just now, from the beginning to the end, was filled with an evil aura. Obviously it was the secret method of the evil sect. With a long sword in his hand, he stood in the middle of the forest. His eyes were cold as he coldly looked around. In the dusky forest, the tree shadows quietly swayed, shadows everywhere, as if there were human figures everywhere, but also as if there were none. Only the wind quietly blowing in the depths of the darkness, like an ice-cold knife. The murderous aura was so cold that it made one's goosebumps rise. Then, he heard a deep roar. The masked man's body paused for a moment and then turned his head to look, frowned slightly, his eyes cold. At the place where he came from, a big black dog was baring its fangs at him. The fur on its back stood up, opened its mouth to reveal its sharp fangs, like a ferocious beast that was about to pounce at any moment. That masked man did not have the slightest fear, even his eyes showed some disgust. After confirming that Lu Chen was indeed very cunning, even if he had cultivated to this level, he still had no way to quickly locate him. The masked man turned his target to the black dog. He seemed to snort coldly, took 2 steps towards the Atsu with the sword in his hand. You might be able to learn a few tricks to hide here and there, but did this big dumb dog know it too? The long sword in his hand, the tip of the sword faintly flashed. The murderous aura was like a tide, gushing towards the Atsu. However, the next moment, suddenly, an even bigger shadow appeared out of nowhere. A huge soul stepped through the darkness, standing next to the black dog. Oxen walked out of the darkness, stood next to the black dog, and raised his head to look at the masked man. The masked man suddenly stopped in his tracks. He did not retreat, nor did he have the intention to escape. He did not even feel fear. He stared at the sudden appearance of the oxen, his brows slightly furrowed, as if he felt that this was a little troublesome. The murderous aura in the air did not disappear. It was still condensed around the masked man, gathered on the long sword that was as bright as autumn water. Oxen looked at the masked man standing in the darkness. He seemed to be a little cautious. Suddenly, both sides seemed to have fallen into a strange atmosphere of confrontation. No one spoke. No one made any movement. But in that oppressive atmosphere, the long sword in the masked man's hand slowly flickered. It seemed to gradually start to brighten again. Suddenly, Oxen let out a moo sound, took a step forward. There was a faint sound of wind blowing around it. It was also at this moment, in the darkness further away, suddenly, a white figure swayed. The masked man looked in that direction, and suddenly was startled. It was a beautiful young girl. It was White Lotus, hiding behind a tree, quietly looking in this direction. With such a thing happening and such a huge commotion, of course, everyone was woken up. But for some reason, when the masked man looked at White Lotus, there was something different. He stared at the young girl, and after a while, he looked at the dark forest around him, once again confirming that he really did not see where Lu Chen was hiding. He seemed to sigh softly, then he pulled back his hand, turned around, put away the long sword in an instant, and flew away, instantly disappearing into the night. Like a phantom of the night, he came and went without a trace. In the forest, White Lotus slowly walked out. Oxen and Atsu stared in the direction where the masked man disappeared. After a while, suddenly, somewhere in the forest, a shadow suddenly shook, and then Lu Chen fell out of it. White Lotus and Oxen immediately ran to him, but Lu Chen put his hand on his chest, and after spitting out a mouthful of blood, he frowned and whispered to himself, "What is the sect leader's token?" You're tuning into the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.